Welcome to the world of darkness where nightmares inhabit your dreams. I've noticed YouTube's algorithm hides my stories. Your interaction is the only way to reach new listeners. If these stories frighten you, please like, subscribe, and activate notifications. Any comment, however brief, helps spread my stories to other horror fans. Now relax, close your eyes, and let the rain wash away your thoughts as I guide you through tonight's terrifying tale. The summer of 1976 marked a turning point in my life, one that would leave an indelible stain on my childhood memories. I was 10 years old when my father's job as a hunting guide pulled our family from the flat plains of Amarillo, Texas, to the mountainous terrain of Leadville, Colorado. The town sat nestled in the heart of the Rocky Mountains at an elevation that made my chest tighten with each breath during those first few days. My mother, Joanne, tried to mask her apprehension with forced enthusiasm as we drove through Main Street, passing weathered storefronts and locals who stared at our Texas license plates with unmasked curiosity. My father, William, gripped the steering wheel of our Dodge van with calloused hands, his eyes scanning the surrounding forest that seemed to swallow the town from all sides. "It's beautiful," my mother said, though I detected the hesitation in her voice. "A fresh start for all of us, right, Catherine?" I nodded, pressing my face against the cool glass of the window. Leadville wasn't like anywhere I'd ever lived before. The national forests surrounding it created a natural prison of pine and aspen, beautiful yet somehow threatening in its vastness. We had arranged temporary housing before arriving, a mobile home on the outskirts of town that my father had secured through a newspaper listing. As we drove away from civilization toward our new residence, the trees grew thicker, the road narrower, until we turned onto a dirt path that wound through a dense section of woods. "This can't be right," my mother whispered. But the mailbox at the entrance to the property confirmed we had arrived. The mobile home sat in a small clearing, its white exterior dulled to a sickly gray by years of mountain weather. Behind it loomed a larger house, 2 stories of faded yellow clapboard with peeling paint and windows that resembled vacant eyes staring down at our arrival. A woman emerged from the house as my father cut the engine. She moved with stiff precision across the yard, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it stretched her skin. Her name was Ruth Bellows, our landlady. When she smiled, her lips barely moved, creating more of a grimace than a welcome. "You must be the Collinses," she said, extending a hand that felt cold and brittle when I reluctantly shook it. "That's right. I'm William. This is my wife Joanne and our daughter Catherine." Ruth's eyes lingered on me a moment too long. "What a pretty girl," she said in a tone that made me step closer to my mother. "My son will be pleased to have new neighbors. He gets so lonely up here." As if summoned by her words, a man appeared on the porch of the yellow house. He stood motionless, watching us unload our suitcases. Though I couldn't make out his features clearly from that distance, his stillness unsettled me. He made no move to help or introduce himself. "That's Victor," Ruth explained, noticing my stare. "He's shy around newcomers, but he'll warm up." The mobile home's interior smelled of mothballs and something else, a damp, earthy scent that clung to the back of my throat. It was furnished with dated pieces that had likely been there for decades, a mustard-colored sofa with cigarette burns on the armrests, a dining table with 4 mismatched chairs, and beds with mattresses that sagged in the middle. "It's temporary," my father assured us as he helped my mother unpack our kitchenware, "just until we find something better in town." That night, I lay awake on sheets that smelled faintly of someone else, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Colorado wilderness. The wind whispered through the trees, branches scratched against the thin walls of our new home, and somewhere in the distance, an animal cried out in a way that sounded almost human. I didn't realize then that the true predators weren't lurking in the forest. They were much closer, watching, waiting, and preparing to strike. Our first week in Leadville passed in a blur of unpacking and adjustment. My father spent most days exploring potential hunting spots in the surrounding mountains, sometimes taking me along while my mother organized our new living space. She was fastidious about making the trailer feel like home, scrubbing every surface and rearranging furniture to eliminate any trace of previous tenants. "I don't like it here," I confessed on our third night as she tucked me into bed. Her hand paused on the blanket. "It's just new, honey. We'll get used to it." "No," I insisted. "Something feels wrong." She sighed, brushing hair from my forehead. "Your imagination is working overtime. It's just the woods and being away from Texas." But it wasn't just homesickness. Even at 10, I recognized the difference between sadness and the creeping discomfort that had settled into my stomach. It intensified whenever Victor Bellows was nearby, which became increasingly frequent as the days passed. I first noticed him watching me from his bedroom window while I explored the small yard. Later, he appeared at the edge of the trees as I collected pine cones, his tall figure unnaturally still among the swaying branches. He never approached, never spoke, just observed with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My mother noticed too. I caught her drawing the curtains more frequently, checking the locks before bed with careful attention. She jumped at unexpected noises and kept me closer than usual when we were outside. On the 5th day, I discovered a small pile of animal bones arranged in a neat circle behind our mobile home. They were clean, bleached white by the sun, positioned with deliberate care. "Probably just from hunting," my father dismissed when I showed him. "The previous renters might have processed game here." But the placement seemed too intentional, too recent. That night, I woke to scratching sounds outside my window, light, methodical, like fingernails dragging across the metal siding. When I peered through the curtains, I saw nothing but darkness. Yet the certainty of a presence lingered. The next morning, my mother discovered small, muddy footprints on the kitchen floor, too small for any of us, leading from the back door to the refrigerator and back. The door had been locked. We were certain of it. "Maybe we tracked it in yesterday," my father suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. My mother scrubbed the floor until her knuckles turned raw, her lips pressed into a thin line of worry. That afternoon, Ruth appeared at our door with a basket of homemade preserves, jams and pickled vegetables in glass jars with handwritten labels. "A welcome gift," she announced, pushing the basket into my mother's reluctant hands. "Victor picked the berries himself. He's quite the forager." The jams glowed an unnatural shade of red in the sunlight. "That's very kind," my mother said, setting the basket on the counter as soon as Ruth left. She never opened a single jar. Later that day, I spotted Victor at the edge of the clearing, kneeling to examine something on the ground. When he stood, I saw he held a small animal, a rabbit, limp in his hands. Our eyes met across the distance, and he smiled for the first time, a thin, humorless stretching of lips that revealed too many teeth. He raised the dead rabbit in a gesture almost like a toast before disappearing into the woods. I told my parents, who exchanged worried glances. "Stay away from him," my mother instructed. "Don't go into the woods alone." That night, we heard movement on the roof, slow, deliberate steps crossing from one end to the other. My father grabbed the flashlight and his hunting knife, stepping outside to investigate while my mother and I huddled together on the sofa. He returned moments later, face pale in the dim light. "Nothing there," he reported. "Must have been an animal." But I had seen his expression before he composed it, the flash of fear in his eyes. On our 6th day in Leadville, we returned from grocery shopping to find the front door unlocked. My mother froze on the steps, keys dangling from her fingers. "I locked it," she whispered. "William, I know I locked it." My father pushed past her, entering cautiously. Maybe it didn't catch properly. The interior appeared undisturbed, nothing missing, nothing moved, but an unfamiliar scent hung in the air, musky and human. My mother checked every closet, every hiding place, while my father examined the locks for signs of tampering. That night, we pushed the dining table against the door before going to bed. None of us slept well, listening for sounds of intrusion that never came. The silence felt more threatening than noise would have been, as if something was waiting, holding its breath alongside us in the darkness. The seventh day began with deceptive normalcy. My father had planned a day trip to scout potential hunting locations deeper in the mountains, and for once my mother agreed to accompany him, bringing me along rather than leaving me alone at the mobile home. The mountain air felt cleaner away from the Bellows property, and I remember laughing for the first time since our arrival as we picnicked beside a stream. "See, it's not all bad here," my father said, watching me wade in the shallow water. My mother smiled, but her eyes remained vigilant, scanning the tree line periodically. Even miles away, the unease followed us. We returned late afternoon, the sun already beginning its descent behind the mountains. My father pulled up to our mobile home and cut the engine, frowning at the strange stillness of the property. "The Bellows truck is gone," he noted. My mother visibly relaxed. "Good. Let's get dinner started." As we approached our door, she stopped abruptly. "William," she said, her voice tight. "The door." Once again it stood unlocked, though my mother had checked it 3 times before we left. My father entered first, body tense as he surveyed the interior. Nothing appeared disturbed, yet all of us sensed the violation of our space, the invisible fingerprints of an intruder lingering on our possessions. "I'm calling the sheriff tomorrow," my father declared. "This has gone far enough." My mother nodded, moving mechanically to the kitchen to prepare dinner. She pulled orange juice from the refrigerator, pouring glasses for herself and me while my father washed up. I watched her set my glass on the table, then turned back to retrieve milk for the mashed potatoes she planned to make. What happened next unfolds in my memory with horrifying clarity. My mother opened the milk carton and began pouring, then stopped, staring at the liquid as it splattered into the bowl. Rather than flowing smoothly, it came out in thick, chunky globs. "That's strange," she murmured, examining the carton. "It shouldn't be expired." She lifted her orange juice, taking a long drink while studying the milk with a frown. I reached for my own glass, but something, perhaps a child's instinct for self-preservation, made me hesitate. Within minutes, my mother's behavior changed. She placed a hand against the counter to steady herself, blinking rapidly. "Joanne?" My father looked up from setting the table. "What's wrong?" "I don't..." She swayed, her face draining of color. "Something's not right." She lurched toward me suddenly, knocking my untouched glass into the sink with frightening urgency. "Don't drink it," she gasped, clutching her stomach. "William, something's in the juice. I need a hospital." My father moved with startling speed, lifting my mother as her knees buckled. Her body began trembling, eyes rolling back as foam gathered at the corners of her mouth. "Catherine, get in the van," he shouted, carrying my mother through the door. I followed in terror, watching my mother's convulsing form in the back seat as my father sped down the dirt road. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring incoherently, sometimes lying so still I feared she had died. The nearest hospital was 15 miles away, in a neighboring town larger than Leadville. Every minute of that journey stretches in my memory, expanded by fear into what felt like hours. I remember praying, simple, desperate pleas to whoever might be listening, as tears streamed down my face. "Stay with me, Joanne," my father kept repeating, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back to touch her arm. "We're almost there." By the time we screeched to a halt at the emergency entrance, my mother had lost consciousness entirely. Medical staff rushed out with a gurney, bombarding my father with questions as they whisked her away. "I think she's been poisoned," he told them, his voice breaking. "The orange juice. Someone put something in our orange juice." They took us to a sterile waiting room where a nurse brought me a cup of water I was too frightened to drink. My father paced relentlessly, stopping nurses for updates they couldn't provide. After what seemed an eternity, a doctor emerged, her expression grave but not devastating. "Your wife is stable," she told my father. "We've pumped her stomach and are administering activated charcoal. Whatever was in her system appears to be some kind of household chemical, possibly antifreeze, based on initial symptoms." "Antifreeze?" My father's face contorted with rage and disbelief. "In our refrigerator?" "The sheriff will want to investigate," the doctor said. "This wasn't accidental." I watched my father's hands clench into fists, his knuckles turning white as the reality settled over us both. Someone had deliberately tried to harm us, to kill us, and had nearly succeeded. The hospital lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, as we waited to learn if my mother would fully recover. In that moment, the true horror of our situation became clear. We had been marked as prey. The hospital corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, its fluorescent lights casting everyone in a sickly pallor that matched my mother's complexion as she lay connected to monitors and IV lines. A police officer had arrived to take my father's statement, guiding him to a small consultation room while a nurse sat with me, offering bland reassurances that did nothing to ease the knot of fear in my stomach. Hours passed in that timeless way, unique to hospitals and emergencies. Eventually, the doctor returned with cautious optimism. "Mrs. Collins is responding well to treatment," she informed us. "We'll need to keep her overnight for observation, but barring complications, she should be able to go home tomorrow." Home. The word, once comforting, now carried sinister implications. My father nodded grimly, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. "Can I see her?" he asked. "Briefly. She's still quite weak." My mother looked smaller somehow, diminished against the white hospital sheets. Her eyes, when they focused on us, contained a new wariness I'd never seen before. "Catherine," she whispered, extending a trembling hand that I rushed to hold. "You didn't drink any?" I shook my head, tears spilling. "No, Mom." Relief washed over her features. "Good girl." My father leaned down to kiss her forehead. "Rest now. We'll sort everything out." As we prepared to leave, my father would return to the mobile home to pack essentials for the night, while I would stay with my mother. A nurse stopped us in the hallway. Her name tag read Nurse Beverly, and something in her expression made us pause. "Mr. Collins," she said quietly, glancing around to ensure we were alone. "I need your address for the paperwork." My father provided it, and I watched her face change, eyes widening slightly before she composed herself. "The Bellows property?" she confirmed, lowering her voice further. My father nodded. "We're renting the mobile home from them. Why?" Beverly hesitated, appearing to weigh professional discretion against some internal moral compass. Compassion won out. "You need to leave that place," she said firmly, "as soon as possible." "We've already decided to move after what happened," my father assured her. "No, you don't understand." She gripped his arm with surprising strength. "Those people, the Bellows, there's something wrong with them." My father's posture stiffened. "What do you mean?" Beverly drew us into an empty waiting area, speaking in urgent whispers. "I've lived in this area my whole life. There have been incidents, travelers, seasonal workers, renters. People disappear from that property." "Disappear?" I echoed, my voice small. She nodded grimly. 3 documented cases in the last decade. People pass through, rent from the Bellows, then vanish. Personal items left behind, vehicles abandoned. She looked at my father intently. Police investigated, but the Bellows always had explanations. Renters leaving suddenly in the night, breaking leases without notice. "And the police believed them?" my father asked incredulously. "Small town," Beverly shrugged. "No bodies, no evidence of foul play, just unusual circumstances. But locals know. We warn people away from that property when we can." My father's face darkened. "Are you saying they tried to poison my wife?" "I'm saying be careful and leave. Tonight, if possible." She pressed a scrap of paper into his hand. "My brother runs the Pine View Motel in town. Tell him Beverly sent you. He'll give you a room, no questions asked." As Beverly walked away, my father stared at the paper, his jaw clenched. "Dad?" I tugged his sleeve. "Is Mom going to be okay?" He knelt to my level, his eyes serious. "Yes, sweetheart. And we're going to be okay too. I'm going to make sure of it." He arranged for me to stay in my mother's room, setting up a cot beside her bed. A police officer would remain stationed outside. Standard procedure for suspected poisoning cases, they assured us, though I suspected Beverly might have had something to do with this precaution. Before leaving, my father hugged me tightly. "Lock the door behind me," he instructed. "Don't open it for anyone but me or the medical staff." Alone with my semi-conscious mother, I sat rigidly in the visitor's chair, jumping at every shadow and footstep in the hallway. The hospital sounds, beeping monitors, squeaking shoes on linoleum, distant announcements over the intercom, formed a soundtrack to my mounting dread. What if my father encountered the Bellows at the property? What if they realized we knew? What if he didn't come back? My imagination conjured horrific scenarios. Victor Bellows stepping from the shadows with a hunting knife, Ruth's brittle smile as she offered more homemade preserves, my father's vehicle abandoned on that lonely dirt road leading to our temporary home. The hours crawled by with excruciating slowness. I must have dozed eventually, because I startled awake to a gentle knock at the door. Peering through the narrow window, I saw my father's exhausted face and quickly let him in. "Everything okay?" I asked anxiously. His expression told me otherwise. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said, glancing at my mother's sleeping form. "Get some rest." But as he settled into the chair beside my cot, I noticed his knuckles were scraped raw, and a dark stain that looked suspiciously like blood marked the cuff of his shirt. I pretended not to see, but sleep remained elusive as I wondered what had happened at the Bellows property and what awaited us when morning came. The sterile hospital room offered little comfort as night deepened, my father's troubled breathing punctuating the mechanical beeps monitoring my mother's condition. Around 2 a.m., a nurse came to check vitals, her movements efficient in the dim light. "Your wife is stable," she assured my father. "The doctor is confident she'll make a full recovery." He nodded gratefully, but the tension in his shoulders remained. After the nurse left, I feigned sleep while watching through half-closed eyes as my father retrieved something from his jacket, a small, crumpled piece of paper that he studied in the blue glow of the emergency light. "Dad?" I finally whispered. "What happened back at the trailer?" He startled, quickly tucking the paper away. "I thought you were asleep, Catherine." "I can't sleep. Please tell me." His sigh seemed to come from somewhere deep and weary. After a moment's hesitation, he moved to sit on the edge of my cot. "I went back to get some clothes and essentials," he began, voice low to avoid disturbing my mother. When I pulled up, I saw Victor Bellows standing in the yard, watching the trailer. The image sent a chill through me. The tall, gaunt man silhouetted against the night sky, waiting. "It was after midnight," my father continued. "No reason for him to be there, and he had a rifle." My breath caught. "Did he try to hurt you?" "No, not directly." My father ran a hand through his hair. When he saw me arrive, he approached the van, asked why we were back so late. I told him your mother had fallen ill and needed medical attention. "What did he say?" "Nothing at first, just stared at me with this expression." My father seemed to struggle finding words, like he was disappointed. Then he asked if she'd eaten dinner. The implication hung in the air between us, Victor knowing exactly why my mother was hospitalized. "I started grabbing our things," my father continued. "Told him we wouldn't be staying another night. He followed me inside, watching every move. Kept asking questions about your mother, what symptoms she had, what the doctor said." I pictured Victor's lanky frame filling our doorway, his calculating eyes tracking my father's movements. When I mentioned we'd be staying at a motel until we found a new place, he became agitated. Said we'd signed a lease, couldn't just leave. My father's voice hardened. Then he mentioned you. The monitor tracking my mother's heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud in the pause that followed. "What about me?" I finally asked. He said it was a shame you'd have to be uprooted again, that you seemed to be settling in nicely. My father's hands clenched. Said he'd been watching you explore the property, that you reminded him of another little girl who'd stayed there years ago. Nausea rose in my throat as I recalled the sensation of being observed during my solitary explorations. eyes following from the tree line, from darkened windows. I told him we were leaving regardless, that I'd return for the rest of our belongings tomorrow. My father's voice dropped further. That's when he blocked the door, said we needed to reconsider, that his mother would be very upset. What did you do? A muscle twitched in my father's jaw. I did what I had to. I'm not proud of it. I understood then, the scraped knuckles, the blood on his cuff. My father had fought his way out. He didn't follow you? I asked, glancing fearfully at the hospital room door. No. Last I saw, he was picking himself up off the porch steps. My father squeezed my hand. We're safe here tonight. Tomorrow we'll go to the motel Beverly recommended, then find a permanent place in town. What about our stuff? I'll go back with the sheriff. Don't worry about that now. But worry was all I could do, imagining the bellows' rage, their retaliation. When my father thought I'd finally drifted off, I heard him whispering into the hospital phone at the bedside, arranging for police accompaniment to retrieve our belongings. They tried to kill my wife, he hissed into the receiver. I don't care if there's no proof yet. You need to investigate them. Whatever response he received left him dissatisfied, his frustrated exhale followed by a defeated, "Fine, just meet me there at 9. Morning arrived with harsh, fluorescent clarity. My mother woke disoriented but stronger, the color returning to her cheeks. The doctor arrived early, confirming she could be discharged by afternoon. The toxicology results won't be back for days, he explained, but we're confident with supportive care, you'll recover fully. As my mother dressed, moving with deliberate care, my father prepared to leave for the trailer one final time. I'll be back within 2 hours, he promised, kissing my mother's forehead. Then we're checking into the Pine View Motel until we find somewhere permanent. Be careful, my mother urged, gripping his sleeve. If they're there. The sheriff is meeting me, he assured her. Nothing will happen. But as he walked out, I caught a glimpse of something tucked into his waistband beneath his jacket, the handle of his hunting knife, ready for whatever awaited him at the Bellows property. The hospital discharged my mother shortly after noon, her body still weak from the ordeal, but deemed stable enough to leave medical supervision. We waited in uncomfortable vinyl chairs near the entrance for my father, who had promised to return by 11 with our essential belongings. As the minutes ticked by with no sign of him, my mother's composure began to fracture. He should have called by now, she murmured, repeatedly checking the wall clock. Something's wrong. At 12:30, just as my mother was preparing to call the sheriff's department, my father's van appeared in the parking lot. Relief washed over us both, quickly replaced by alarm when we saw his expression as he entered. A tightly controlled mask of rage, beneath which something like fear flickered. What happened? My mother asked, rising unsteadily to meet him. Not here, he replied, glancing at the hospital staff within earshot. Let's go. Once inside the van with doors locked and the engine running, he explained in clipped sentences. The sheriff was late. By the time he arrived, I'd already gone inside. Everything had been disturbed, drawers left open, clothes tossed about. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. They went through all our things, Joanne. Every single item. Were they there? My mother's voice trembled slightly. No, place was empty. Their truck was gone from the property. He pulled onto the main road, eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. The sheriff took photos, made a report, but said there wasn't much they could do without direct evidence of tampering. What about the orange juice? I asked from the back seat. Didn't they test it? They took samples, my father confirmed. But the sheriff said it would take weeks to get results from the state lab, and even then. He trailed off, the implication clear. Nothing might come of it. We drove in tense silence to the Pine View Motel, a single-story structure of weathered wood with a flickering neon sign. The manager, Beverly's brother, a stocky man with wary eyes, checked us in efficiently, requiring minimal information and accepting cash without question. Room 12, he told my father quietly. Back corner, away from the road. Good sight lines. The unspoken understanding passed between them. We were hiding, not just staying. The motel room offered little comfort beyond security. 2 double beds with thin spreads, a bathroom with yellowed tiles, a small television bolted to the wall. But the locks were new and sturdy, with an additional chain and deadbolt. My father immediately secured. My mother sank onto the bed nearest the bathroom, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "Did you get everything we need?" "Enough for a few days." My father began unpacking the suitcases he'd retrieved. "Clothes, toiletries, your medication." I left most of the furniture and kitchen items, not worth going back for. As he sorted through our hastily packed belongings, I noticed something strange. A small item falling from between my folded shirts. A tiny carved wooden figure, roughly the shape of a person, but with exaggerated limbs and no distinguishable face. "Dad," I said, holding it up. "What's this?" He took it, examining the crude object with growing alarm. "Where did you find this?" "It was in my clothes." My parents exchanged a look of unmistakable dread. "I didn't pack this," my father stated flatly. "Someone put it there." The implication hung heavily in the air. The Bellows had not only searched our belongings but had left something behind. A message, a warning, a threat. My mother took the figure with trembling fingers, studying it before suddenly flinging it into the wastebasket. "We're not staying in Leadville," she declared. "As soon as I'm stronger, we're leaving Colorado entirely." My father began to protest. His new job, the lease we'd signed on the hunting lodge office in town, but fell silent at the determination in her eyes. "They poisoned me, William. They would have poisoned Catherine too, if she'd drunk that juice." Her voice broke. "These people have done this before." That nurse wasn't making up stories. That evening, my father ventured out to purchase supplies, additional locks for the motel room, canned food we could prepare without leaving, and a local newspaper with rental listings in neighboring towns. While he was gone, my mother drew me close on the bed, speaking in hushed tones. "I want you to tell me everything you noticed at the trailer," she instructed. "Anything unusual, no matter how small." I described the animal bones I'd found arranged in a circle, the footprints in the kitchen, Victor watching me from the trees. With each detail, her expression grew darker. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" she asked. "I did," I replied, hurt evident in my voice. "You both said it was my imagination." Remorse flashed across her features as she pulled me into a tight embrace. "I'm sorry, Catherine. We should have listened." When my father returned, they conferred in whispers by the bathroom while I pretended to watch television. Their conversation grew heated at points, my father's practical concerns about money and employment clashing with my mother's absolute refusal to remain anywhere near the Bellows. Eventually, they reached a compromise. We would stay at the motel for 2 weeks while my father completed his contractual obligations at the hunting lodge, then leave Colorado for my grandmother's house in Nebraska until we could establish ourselves elsewhere. That night, sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nightmares of Victor Bellows standing over my bed, holding a glass of orange juice in one hand and the faceless wooden figure in the other. I woke, gasping several times, only to find my father sitting vigilant in the chair by the door, his hunting knife on the table beside him. "It's okay," he would whisper each time. "I'm watching. Go back to sleep." But his eyes, red-rimmed and constantly moving to the window, told me he found no more comfort in our temporary sanctuary than I did. The next morning, my father left to speak with his employer while my mother and I remained locked in the motel room. Hours later, he returned with a local newspaper, opening it to a small article tucked away on an inner page. "Suspicious fire destroys rural property." The mobile home we had fled now existed only in our memories, reduced to ash and twisted metal by what authorities called a fire of unknown origin. The article mentioned the Bellows were unharmed, their main house spared from the blaze. "They destroyed the evidence," my mother whispered. My father nodded grimly and sent us a message. For the remainder of our time in Leadville, we lived like fugitives, changing motels every few days, using cash for all transactions, never venturing out alone. My father carried his hunting knife everywhere, while my mother kept me within arm's reach at all times. Twice we spotted Victor Bellows in town, once outside the grocery store, watching our motel from across the street, and later near the hunting lodge where my father worked. He never approached, never spoke, just observed with that same unsettling intensity, a silent promise that he hadn't forgotten us. The day we finally left Leadville, driving east toward Nebraska with our remaining possessions crammed into the van, I looked back to see a familiar truck following at a distance. It maintained this position for nearly 50 miles before finally turning back at the state line, a final reminder that some predators are patient, willing to wait for prey to return to their hunting grounds. The small apartment we eventually found in downtown Leadville offered a facade of normalcy that never quite penetrated beyond the surface of our daily lives. Located above a hardware store on Harrison Avenue, it provided what my parents valued most: proximity to other people, multiple escape routes, and no connection to the Bellows. My father had convinced my mother to stay in Colorado after securing a position with a more established hunting outfitter that offered a substantial salary increase, enough to compensate for the trauma we'd endured. The compromise: we would remain through the hunting season, saving every penny, then reassess our future before winter arrived. Our new home became a fortress of paranoia. My father installed additional deadbolts, window alarms, and a telephone with emergency numbers taped beside it. My mother established rigid protocols. No one entered alone, doors remained locked at all times, and I was never outside without adult supervision. School began in September, bringing a semblance of routine that should have been comforting, but instead created new anxieties. Each morning, my father walked me to the brick schoolhouse 3 blocks away. Each afternoon, my mother waited at the exact same spot to escort me home. The other children noticed our unusual arrangements, their curious whispers following me through the hallways. "Her family's the one that had trouble with the Bellowses," I overheard one teacher telling another. "Terrible business. Best not to ask." Gradually, we learned we weren't alone in our fear. Leadville, like many small towns, harbored secrets beneath its picturesque exterior. As my parents cautiously formed connections with neighbors and colleagues, fragments of the Bellows history emerged through careful conversations. Ruth Bellows had inherited the property from her husband, who died under circumstances locals described as strange, without elaborating. Victor, their only child, had attended Leadville School until an incident in his early teens prompted his mother to withdraw him for home education. Now in his 30s, he rarely interacted with townspeople except when necessary, preferring the isolation of their forest property. "They keep to themselves," was the generous assessment from those inclined to charity. "Something not right with that family," was the more common sentiment, often accompanied by a meaningful glance in my direction and a change of subject. One evening in October, as autumn painted the surrounding mountains in brilliant gold and crimson, a knock at our apartment door sent my mother rushing me into the bedroom while my father approached cautiously, hand resting on the knife he still carried. "Who is it?" he called through the wood. "Beverly Hanson," came the reply, "from the hospital." My parents exchanged glances before my father verified through the peephole and cautiously admitted the nurse who had warned us months earlier. "I heard you stayed," she said without preamble, declining the offered seat. "Thought you should have this." She extended a manila envelope, which my father accepted with visible hesitation. "What is it?" "Information. Things the sheriff won't tell you." Beverly glanced at me, still hovering in the bedroom doorway. "Not for little eyes." My mother ushered me fully into the bedroom, closing the door despite my protests. I pressed my ear against the wood, catching only fragments of their hushed conversation. 4th family in 12 years, never enough evidence. Remains found in 69 but couldn't identify. Hunting accidents reported. Watching your apartment. When the door reopened 30 minutes later, my parents' faces had transformed. my mother's drained of color, my father's set in grim determination. "We're leaving next week," he announced after Beverly departed. "I've given notice at work." That night, I woke to the sound of papers rustling in the living room. Creeping from my bed, I peered through the cracked door to see my father studying photographs spread across the coffee table, a tumbler of whiskey at his elbow. I recognized missing persons posters, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be handwritten statements. Among them lay several photos similar to the wooden figure we'd found in my clothes, crude carvings with distorted limbs and featureless heads. More disturbing were the images of bones, human remains discovered in the National Forest near the Bellows property, according to the notations. Evidence deemed inconclusive by authorities unwilling or unable to connect the scattered pieces. As my father methodically documented everything in a notebook, I retreated to bed, understanding for the first time that what had happened to us was merely one chapter in a longer, darker narrative, one that continued unfolding in the shadows of Leadville's mountains. The following days passed in a blur of packing and preparation. My father sold or donated everything we couldn't fit in our van, while my mother withdrew me from school with vague explanations about family emergencies elsewhere. Throughout this frantic activity, I became aware of a dark truck appearing with increasing frequency on our street, sometimes parked across from our building, sometimes slowly circling the block. Though we never clearly saw the driver, the vehicle's deliberate presence sent my mother into panic attacks that left her gasping for breath behind locked doors. The night before our planned departure, my father sat me down for a conversation I would never forget. "Catherine," he began, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his shoulders. "Tomorrow we're leaving Leadville for good. I need you to understand something important." I nodded, sensing the gravity in his tone. "What happened to us here? What almost happened to your mother wasn't random. Those people, the Bellows, they've done this before. They choose families like ours, newcomers, people without connections." "Why?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. He hesitated, clearly weighing how much a child should know about human predators. "Some people hunt animals," he finally said. "Others hunt people. Not for food, but for something else, something broken inside them that feeds on fear and control." The explanation, while simplified, contained enough truth to send shivers through me. My father continued, placing his weathered hands on my shoulders. "I need you to promise me something. If you ever see Victor or Ruth Bellows again, even years from now, even in another state, you run. You find people, crowds, authorities. You don't listen to anything they say. Don't go anywhere near them. Understand?" I promised solemnly, though part of me believed, hoped we were leaving the nightmare behind permanently. That night, as final preparations were completed and our few remaining possessions staged for early departure, a sound at the window jolted all of us awake around midnight. A light scratching, deliberate and rhythmic, like fingernails on glass. My father approached with his hunting knife, pulling back the curtain to reveal nothing but darkness. Yet when he shined his flashlight across the pane, we all saw it. A crude figure carved from fresh wood placed precisely on the outer sill of our second-story window. We left before dawn, abandoning our final month's rent and the last of our furniture. As our van pulled away from Leadville in the gray morning light, I looked back to see a now familiar truck turning onto Harrison Avenue. Too late to prevent our escape, but a final reminder that we had been marked, cataloged, and would not be forgotten by the hunters who had selected us as prey. The journey away from Leadville marked the beginning of a different kind of existence for our family. We traveled east without a clear destination, eventually settling in a medium-sized city in the Midwest, where anonymity offered a shield against the shadows that had followed us from Colorado. My father found work as a sporting goods salesman, my mother as a school secretary. We never again lived on the outskirts of town or in isolated properties. For years we maintained vigilant habits that must have seemed strange to outsiders. checking locks multiple times, avoiding strangers who showed too much interest, keeping detailed records of unusual occurrences. My parents never explained these precautions to friends or colleagues, and I learned to present a normalized version of our family to the world. But privately, we knew. The bellows had changed us permanently, installing an awareness of human predators that could never be unlearned. As I grew older, my parents gradually shared more details about what Beverly Hansen had given them that October night in 1976. The envelope contained what she had meticulously documented over decades, a pattern of disappearances, suspicious deaths, and near misses connected to the bellows property. The earliest recorded incident dated to 1954, when Ruth and her husband Martin purchased the land. Within months, a family renting a cabin on their property abruptly departed, leaving most possessions behind. Police reports noted no evidence of foul play, despite bloodstains discovered on mattresses that the bellows attributed to a hunting accident. Similar scenarios repeated throughout the years. Transient workers vanishing without collecting final paychecks. Travelers whose vehicles were later found abandoned near national forest trailheads. And renters who stopped communicating with distant family members. In each case, investigations stalled against the same obstacles: insufficient evidence, jurisdictional complications between town and federal forest authorities, and the bellows' careful maintenance of their public personas as eccentric but harmless recluses. Beverly, whose position at the regional hospital gave her unique insights, had documented at least 17 suspicious incidents over 22 years. Toxicology reports showing unusual substances in patients' systems, hunting accidents with inconsistent wound patterns, travelers treated for symptoms consistent with various poisons before suddenly checking out against medical advice, never to be seen again. Most disturbing were the wooden figures, identical to the one found among my clothes, that occasionally appeared in connection with these cases. Sometimes discovered among victims' possessions, sometimes left at their empty residences, these crude carvings seemed to serve as the bellows signature, or perhaps trophies transformed into warnings. The summer I turned 18, I found my father in his study, staring at a newspaper article he'd received from a contact who still lived near Leadville. "Ruth Bellows died," he said, passing me the obituary. "Natural causes, apparently." The brief notice mentioned her age, 79, and that she was survived by her son Victor, who would continue managing the family property. A property that, according to the article, would soon expand to include additional rental cabins to serve the growing tourism industry. My father made a single phone call that evening to the Leadville Sheriff's Department, warning them about the potential danger to future renters. Whether they took his concerns seriously, we never learned. The pattern continued. Over the decades that followed, I built a life intentionally separate from the trauma of our Colorado experience. College, career, marriage. Each milestone took me further from the frightened child who had narrowly escaped becoming another statistic in Beverly Hansen's grim archives. Yet the experience shaped me in undeniable ways. I studied criminology in university, wrote my thesis on predatory behavior in isolated communities, and eventually worked as a consultant for a victim advocacy organization. The psychological mechanisms that allowed the bellows to operate undetected for so long became my professional focus, a way of transforming personal terror into purpose. In 1992, following my father's death from heart failure, my mother finally shared the complete contents of Beverly's envelope, including photographs too disturbing for a child's eyes. Skeletal remains discovered in the National Forest in 1969, suspected to belong to a family of 4 who had rented from the bellows before vanishing. Medical reports documenting toxins similar to those used against my mother, and police interviews with Victor Bellows that revealed his unsettling affect and calculated responses. "Your father wanted you to have these," my mother explained, "not to frighten you, but because he believed knowledge was protection." I spent months researching what had happened in the years since our escape, tracking newspaper archives and court records. Victor Bellows remained at the property, now expanded to include 6 rental cabins frequently advertised in tourism publications. Occasional reports of missing hikers or travelers appeared in regional papers, though none directly linked to the Bellows property. In 2001, I received a phone call from an unfamiliar number. The woman introduced herself as Detective Miranda Wilson with the Colorado State Police. "I'm investigating cold cases in Lake County," she explained. "Your family filed a report in 1976 regarding attempted poisoning at a property owned by Ruth and Victor Bellows." My heart raced as I confirmed the details, learning that Wilson had discovered Beverly Hanson's records following the nurse's death and was reopening several investigations connected to the Bellows property. "We're excavating portions of the national forest adjacent to the property," she told me. "Ground-penetrating radar has identified several anomalies consistent with burial sites." For a brief period, I allowed myself to hope for resolution, justice for those who hadn't escaped as we had. But 3 months later, Detective Wilson called again with devastating news. A forest fire had swept through the excavation area, destroying evidence and forcing authorities to prioritize emergency response over cold case investigations. "The Bellows property?" I asked. "Untouched," she replied grimly. "Fire burned right up to their property line, then changed direction. Victor Bellows is claiming divine intervention." When I hung up, I understood what my father had always believed, that some predators are protected by circumstances so consistently favorable they border on supernatural, though the reality is simply human systems failing against patient evil. In 2019, nearly 4 decades after our narrow escape, I returned to Leadville for my mother's funeral. She had requested cremation and burial in the town cemetery beside my father, a final act of defiance showing the Bellows hadn't driven her permanently from a place she had briefly called home. The town had changed, gentrified into a tourist destination with boutique hotels and upscale restaurants catering to wealthy visitors seeking mountain adventures. After the service, I drove cautiously along the familiar road leading to the Bellows property, unsure what I hoped to find. The mobile home was long gone, replaced by modern rental cabins arranged in a semicircle around the original yellow house, now restored to quaint perfection. A sign at the entrance advertised Bellows Historic Mountain Lodging, family-owned since 1954. As I idled at the turnoff, a vehicle emerged from the property, a newer model of the same dark truck that had followed us decades earlier. The driver, an elderly man with white hair but unnervingly familiar posture, slowed as he passed my rental car. For a moment, across 43 years and through different windows, Victor Bellows and I made eye contact. His expression registered no particular recognition, merely the same calculating assessment I remembered from childhood, a predator evaluating potential prey. I drove away quickly, checking my rearview mirror until I reached the safety of downtown. The truck didn't follow, but the encounter confirmed what I had always known. Some hunters never abandon their territories. That evening, as I packed for my early departure, the hotel desk clerk delivered a small package that had been left at reception. "Someone dropped this off for you," she explained cheerfully. "No message." Inside the plain brown wrapper, I found a crude wooden figure with distorted limbs and a featureless head, identical to the one discovered among my childhood belongings 4 decades earlier. I left Leadville before dawn, disposing of the figure at a rest stop 2 counties away. In the years since, I've monitored news reports from Colorado, noting occasional mentions of missing hikers last seen near the national forest surrounding Leadville. Official explanations cite treacherous terrain, extreme weather conditions, or encounters with wildlife. Those who survived the Bellows know better. We recognize the signature of human predators who select their hunting grounds carefully, choosing locations where disappearances can be attributed to natural dangers, rather than calculated malice. The true horror of what happened in Leadville wasn't the confrontation with evil, but the recognition that such evil can operate indefinitely when systems designed for protection fail to connect the patterns revealed over time. Ruth Bellows died of natural causes. Victor continues the family business, and travelers still vanish in the beautiful, dangerous wilderness surrounding their property. I've often wondered about that orange juice my mother drank in 1976, whether the poison was intended to kill quickly or to gradually debilitate, allowing for a more prolonged hunt. I wonder about the families who preceded us and those who followed, whose stories ended differently because they drank deeply from what was offered without the instinctive hesitation that saved me. Most of all, I wonder if the faceless wooden figures represent those who disappeared, anonymous trophies of completed hunts, or if they serve as markers for prey that escaped, reminders of unfinished business in a game the Bellows family has played for generations. I keep a locked file of newspaper clippings, police reports, and correspondence with Detective Wilson, who continued investigating until her retirement in 2015. Someday, perhaps, another investigator will connect enough dots to end the pattern. Until then, I maintain my vigilance, knowing that predators are patient, with memories as long as their hunting grounds are remote. The lesson of Leadville remains. The most dangerous wilderness is not the forest itself, but the isolated human spaces where predators establish territories beyond the reach of protection. In such places, locked doors provide little security when the true threat already holds the keys. The discovery occurred during early autumn of 2022, when the forests surrounding my rural hometown began their annual transformation. I consider myself a practical person, someone grounded in reality and skeptical of supernatural claims, though I maintain a scientist's openness to phenomena beyond current understanding. This mindset served me well during my weekend explorations of the undeveloped woodlands near my property. I had recently purchased a modest cabin approximately 30 miles from the nearest town, seeking respite from corporate life. The surrounding forest offered both recreation and tranquility, with established hiking trails that satisfied my initial curiosity. However, after several months of familiarity with these standard paths, I developed an interest in venturing beyond mapped territory. During a particularly clear Saturday morning in September, I noticed an unmarked trail veering northwest from the main pathway. According to my topographical maps, this area remained largely unexplored by recreational hikers. Equipped with my standard gear, compass, water supply, emergency provisions, communication device, and protective items, I documented my intended route before proceeding into this unfamiliar territory. The first mile presented typical deciduous woodland, consistent with the regional ecosystem I had come to know well. Oak, maple, and birch trees dominated the landscape, with undergrowth that indicated regular wildlife activity. Nothing suggested abnormality or reason for concern. I methodically noted distinctive landmarks and took periodic compass readings to ensure a straightforward return journey. Approximately 90 minutes into this exploration, the environment underwent a striking transition. The diverse hardwood forest abruptly yielded to an exclusive stand of pine trees. The demarcation appeared unusually precise, almost artificially so, as though someone had intentionally cultivated this monoculture. The pines stood tall and densely packed, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere where sunlight filtered through in narrow, dust-illuminated beams. The transition affected more than visual perception. The acoustic properties changed dramatically. The forest floor, covered in fallen needles, absorbed sound in a manner that created an unnatural stillness. Even common woodland sounds, birds calling, small animals moving through underbrush, seemed strangely absent. The air carried a concentrated, resinous scent that, while not unpleasant, possessed an intensity that suggested confinement rather than open woodland. Despite growing unease regarding this ecological anomaly, scientific curiosity compelled me to continue forward. I documented the coordinates of this boundary and proceeded with heightened attention to my surroundings. The uniformity of the pine forest created navigational challenges. Without distinctive landmarks, I relied more heavily on my compass and GPS tracking. After advancing approximately another mile into this homogeneous environment, I encountered the first inexplicable event. A child's voice pierced the unnatural silence. A girl, sounding approximately 8 to 10 years old, calling desperately for her father. The voice emanated from behind my position, characterized by panic that triggered an immediate protective response. I turned rapidly, expecting to find a lost child requiring assistance. Nothing appeared in my visual field. The space behind me contained only pine trees extending into shadowed distance. I called out a response, offering help and requesting the child's location. My voice seemed absorbed by the surrounding environment, traveling less distance than physics would suggest possible in an open woodland setting. After several attempts at communication yielded no response, I considered options. A lost child constituted a genuine emergency requiring action, yet the situation contained concerning inconsistencies. The voice had sounded close, within 20 yards by acoustic estimation, yet no visual evidence supported a human presence. Furthermore, this remote location made a child's presence highly improbable. The nearest residential area required crossing difficult terrain unsuitable for young hikers. I decided to continue forward while maintaining heightened awareness, reasoning that if someone genuinely needed assistance, they would likely call out again or attempt to locate the source of my response. Approximately 60 seconds later, as predicted, the child's voice recurred. This second auditory event contained identical linguistic content, the same words calling for daddy with the same inflection and emotional quality. However, the acoustic proximity had increased significantly. The voice now sounded approximately 10 yards closer than before, though again, visual inspection revealed no human presence. My discomfort intensified. The identical nature of the vocalization suggested a recording rather than genuine human communication, yet no technological source appeared evident. Additionally, the calculated movement pattern, approaching from behind rather than maintaining static position or moving randomly, suggested intentionality inconsistent with either a lost child or abandoned recording device. I increased my pace while maintaining my original direction, documenting the experience through voice notes on my phone while continuously scanning my surroundings. The environmental characteristics remained consistent as I progressed deeper into the pine forest. Sunlight diminished as the canopy thickened overhead, creating a premature twilight effect despite the mid-afternoon hour. Temperature decreased noticeably, approximately 5 degrees based on my equipment readings, without corresponding weather changes or elevation differences that would explain such variation. Precisely 118 seconds after the second auditory event, the child's voice manifested again. This third occurrence demonstrated two significant changes. First, the acoustic proximity suggested a position directly behind me, within arm's reach. Second, the emotional quality had intensified, with vocal characteristics suggesting extreme distress rather than mere confusion. I executed an immediate, complete rotation while simultaneously stepping backward. The physical space around me remained devoid of visible presence. No movement disturbed the pine needles covering the forest floor. No disruption appeared in the air that would suggest a recently vacated position. Before I could process this third event, a new auditory phenomenon occurred. A male voice, deep, measured, and addressing me directly, spoke from an approximate position 2 feet to my right. The voice made a statement regarding my presence in his forest, though the exact wording became difficult to recall in subsequent analysis. This development transformed my scientific curiosity into genuine concern for personal safety. The calculated positioning of these auditory events, behind and beside me, progressively closer, never visible, suggested a deliberate attempt to disorient and intimidate rather than genuine communication. I unsheathed my tactical knife, a standard safety precaution for wilderness exploration rather than an intended weapon, and initiated an immediate retreat, maintaining a backward-facing position while establishing fastest possible movement toward my entry point. My physical dimensions and military background typically provide confidence when facing uncertain situations. However, this experience generated a psychological response disproportionate to tangible threat evidence. The violation of established physical laws, sounds without sources, voices without bodies, created a fundamental disruption of reality that intellectual preparation cannot adequately address. My retreat required navigational precision despite emotional distress. The homogeneous environment offered minimal distinctive features for orientation, making compass readings essential despite the urgency of departure. I maintained awareness of directional integrity while executing a controlled evacuation at maximum sustainable speed. Approximately 45 seconds into this withdrawal, acoustic phenomena intensified in both frequency and complexity. The child's voice continued at intervals of approximately 15 seconds, maintaining position directly behind me regardless of my movement speed or directional changes. The male voice established a similar pattern to my right side, now accompanied by audible footsteps that synchronized with my own movement but remained visually unverifiable. Additional sound elements manifested in succession. Whispered conversations at the threshold of audibility, something substantial moving through underbrush that should not have existed in this needle-covered environment. Metallic scraping reminiscent of tools or implements being dragged across hard surfaces. These acoustic events demonstrated strategic positioning, creating a hemispheric pattern around my forward path that suggested choreographed movement by multiple entities. The effect generated psychological pressure to deviate from my chosen evacuation route, potentially driving me deeper into the pine forest rather than toward its boundary. I recognized this pattern as consistent with predatory herding behavior, where coordinated actions by multiple agents direct prey movement toward predetermined destinations. This recognition reinforced my commitment to maintain my established course regardless of psychological discomfort. The physical environment began exhibiting subtle alterations that complicated navigation. Light conditions deteriorated beyond expected forest canopy effects, creating a premature darkness that challenged visual orientation. Temperature continued decreasing without environmental justification. Most concerning, familiar landmarks noted during my inward journey appeared altered or absent upon return, requiring exclusive reliance on compass readings rather than visual confirmation. Despite these compounding challenges, I maintained forward progress while implementing controlled breathing techniques to manage physiological stress responses. My military training provided valuable protocols for maintaining operational effectiveness during high-stress scenarios, though this situation exceeded established parameters for wilderness emergencies. After approximately 17 minutes of sustained movement through increasingly hostile conditions, I detected environmental changes indicating proximity to the pine forest boundary. Light quality improved incrementally. Temperature began normalizing. Acoustic properties demonstrated reduced absorption characteristics consistent with transitioning to mixed forest. These promising indicators coincided with escalation in unexplained phenomena. The auditory events increased in volume and frequency, creating an overlapping pattern that approached continuous sound. The content evolved from discrete communications to a composite of human and non-human vocalizations, crying, whispering, and sounds reminiscent of distress without being identifiably human. Most significantly, tactile sensations joined the auditory phenomena. Something brushed against my shoulder with sufficient pressure to create physical displacement of my clothing. Similar contact occurred against my lower back and the posterior aspect of my right leg in rapid succession. Each contact point experienced a localized temperature drop that persisted for several seconds after the initial sensation. These physical contacts occurred simultaneously with the most proximate auditory events, creating a multisensory experience that severely tested my psychological resilience. The absence of visual confirmation for these physical interactions created a cognitive dissonance that threatened to overwhelm rational thought processes. I increased my pace to maximum sustainable speed, prioritizing directional accuracy while accepting increased risk of environmental hazards such as unseen obstacles or terrain irregularities. The calculated risk assessment indicated that expedition from this environment outweighed standard safety protocols for wilderness navigation. As I approached the estimated boundary between pine forest and normal woodland, the combined phenomena reached peak intensity. The soundscape transformed into a continuous overlapping pattern of voices and non-vocal sounds that approached overwhelming volume. Physical contacts occurred at intervals of approximately 3 seconds, creating an almost continuous sensation of being handled by multiple entities simultaneously. The environmental lighting reached minimum visibility thresholds despite the mid-afternoon hour. Temperature decreased to a level that produced visible vapor with each exhalation. Most concerning, the visually perceptible path ahead appeared to shift and reconfigure in ways that contradicted physical possibility, suggesting either environmental manipulation or significant perceptual distortion. The precise moment of transition between pine forest and normal woodland occurred with unexpected abruptness. One step brought me from conditions of near darkness, substantial cold, and continuous multisensory phenomena into standard forest conditions. Normal lighting, seasonal temperature, and complete cessation of unexplained events. The transition created a sensory shock that momentarily disrupted cognitive processing. The sudden absence of stimuli that had reached overwhelming intensity created a vacuum-like experience where normal environmental conditions temporarily registered as insufficient or incomplete. I maintained forward movement while conducting rapid self-assessment for physical injuries or physiological abnormalities. Despite the tactile sensations experienced within the pine forest, no evidence of physical contact remained. No marks on skin, no damage to clothing, no residual materials transferred from another entity. Body temperature normalized rapidly despite the extreme cold experienced moments before. Cognitive function stabilized within approximately 90 seconds of crossing this threshold. I conducted comprehensive environmental assessment to confirm return to standard woodland conditions and verify directional accuracy toward my entry point. All measurements indicated normal conditions consistent with typical regional forest environments, with no evidence of the anomalies experienced within the pine stand. Once basic safety parameters were established, I documented key observations through detailed voice recordings, including timestamps, geographic coordinates, and sequential reconstruction of events while memory remained fresh. This documentation process served dual purposes of creating a reliable record and reestablishing normal cognitive patterns through structured analytical activity. Despite rational assessment indicating complete cessation of anomalous phenomena, I maintained elevated vigilance throughout the remainder of the extraction route. The abrupt transition between conditions raised significant questions regarding the boundary's stability and the potential for phenomena to extend beyond the visually distinctive pine forest. The remaining journey to my original entry point proceeded without further incident. Standard forest conditions prevailed throughout with expected wildlife activity, normal acoustic properties, and consistent environmental parameters. The familiar landmarks previously noted during initial approach appeared in expected sequence and condition, confirming reliable navigation. Upon reaching my transportation, a dual-sport motorcycle suitable for both paved roads and reasonable off-road conditions, I conducted thorough equipment assessment before departure. All items remained in original condition without unexplained alterations or damages. The vehicle started without difficulty and performed according to specifications. The return journey to my residence provided essential decompression time while maintaining necessary focus on operational safety. I deliberately engaged analytical thought processes, reviewing events in sequential order and categorizing phenomena according to sensory channels, intensity progression, and spatial relationships. This preliminary analysis yielded concerning patterns. The phenomena demonstrated apparent intelligence through strategic positioning, escalation relative to my responses, and coordinated sensory elements. More significantly, the events exhibited knowledge of effective human psychological pressure points, exploiting established fear responses to absence of visual confirmation, strategic use of child distress signals, and calculated escalation patterns that maximized disorientation. Upon reaching my residence, I implemented standard security protocols while conducting a thorough review of documentation collected during the event. I transferred voice recordings to redundant storage, created written transcriptions, and developed preliminary event mapping that correlated phenomena with geographic positions. Despite extensive analysis, rational explanations remained elusive. Environmental factors such as gas pockets, infrasound, or unusual electromagnetic fields could potentially explain isolated elements, but failed to account for the integrated, apparently responsive nature of the complete experience. Psychological factors including situational stress responses, pareidolia, or sensory processing anomalies offered partial explanations, but could not reasonably account for the consistent patterns and multisensory integration observed. In the days following this incident, I conducted extensive research regarding both the specific geographic location and similar reported phenomena. Local historical records indicated no specific anomalies associated with the area, though I noted the relative absence of development or regular human activity in that precise location, despite surrounding land being utilized for various purposes. Environmental analysis using publicly available data showed no obvious geographical, geological, or ecological factors that would explain the distinctive pine monoculture or the phenomena experienced within it. Regional folklore contained limited references to areas of forest considered unwelcoming or disorienting, but nothing that aligned precisely with my experience or location. Scientific literature offered various potential explanations for isolated elements of my experience. Infrasound at specific frequencies can produce anxiety, disorientation, and sensations of presence. Certain environmental toxins, particularly fungal spores present in forest environments, can induce temporary perceptual alterations. Geomagnetic anomalies can affect brain function in ways that produce sensory disturbances. However, these potential explanations failed to account for the apparent intelligence behind the phenomena. The strategic positioning, the escalation patterns correlated with my responses, and the integrated multisensory nature of the experience. These aspects suggested either an unidentified natural phenomenon of extraordinary complexity or intentional agency behind the events. The implications of this experience extend beyond personal curiosity into domains of scientific significance. If the phenomena resulted from natural causes, they represent potentially undocumented interactions between environmental factors and human perception that merit formal investigation. If some form of intelligent agency was involved, the implications become considerably more profound. I have not returned to the location since this incident. While scientific curiosity suggests value in further investigation, risk assessment indicates that additional exposure without comprehensive monitoring equipment and personnel support would constitute an unacceptable safety hazard. Furthermore, the psychological impact of the experience, while manageable through rational analysis, created a residual caution that influences decision-making regarding this specific location. I present this account not as evidence of supernatural occurrence, but as documentation of unexplained phenomena that challenge conventional explanations. My experience in the pine forest represents one of many anomalous events that exist at the boundaries of current understanding, neither conclusively natural nor definitively supernatural, but residing in the uncertainty space that drives scientific inquiry forward. Whatever created these experiences, whether environmental factors, psychological responses, or something beyond current classification, the pine forest remains a location where expected physical rules appeared suspended and where something demonstrated awareness of human presence in ways that defy simple explanation. The file labeled Black Mountain Incident sat on my desk, worn at the edges from countless late-night reviews. Senior Field Agent Ulysses Mercer, Department of Cryptozoological Containment and Research. That's my official title, though few outside our underground facility would recognize it. I work for what we informally call the Division, a covert branch operating beneath the layers of conventional government oversight. Our mission statement, if you could call it that, is deceptively simple. Investigate, document, and when necessary, neutralize cryptid threats. Let me be clear. These aren't the benign creatures of campfire stories or the commercialized monsters that adorn children's cereal boxes. The entities we track are biological anomalies that defy conventional science, predators that have adapted to exist in the shadows of human civilization. They are real, they are dangerous, and they are far more numerous than the general public could ever comprehend without mass panic. I've spent 15 years with the Division, recruited after a tour in Afghanistan, where I encountered something in a remote mountain cave that my military superiors were eager to classify as insurgent activity. It wasn't. Whatever killed those men was ancient and methodical, leaving behind evidence that contradicted every known predator profile. The Division found me before I could file my report, and I've been working for them ever since. This job has cost me a normal life, 2 failed marriages, a daughter who believes I work as a wildlife consultant, a perpetual sense of hypervigilance that makes civilian life feel like a poorly crafted facade. But I stay because someone needs to stand between the everyday world and the horrors that lurk just beyond perception. The Black Mountain operation began like most, with unexplained disappearances and deaths that local authorities couldn't reconcile with conventional explanations. 8 hikers had vanished over 3 months, and 4 bodies had been discovered in conditions that the county coroner refused to detail in official documentation. The local sheriff, overwhelmed and desperate, reached out through channels that eventually filtered to our department. Our 4-person team assembled at headquarters in Arlington. Captain Mason Briggs led the operation, a former Delta Force operator with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had seen too much. Mason had recruited me years ago and became the closest thing to a friend this line of work allowed. His tactical planning was meticulous, his leadership unquestioned. Sarah Chen, our technology specialist, was relatively new to field operations, but brilliant with both conventional and specialized equipment. She had developed several of our tracking devices and had an uncanny ability to establish patterns where others saw only chaos. At 32, she maintained an optimism that seemed increasingly out of place in our line of work. Logan Pierce completed our team, a former Forest Service tracker, whose encounter with something in the Olympic National Forest had left him with a facial scar and an unwavering dedication to our cause. His understanding of wilderness terrain and animal behavior made him invaluable, though his tendency toward isolation concerned Mason. We flew into Asheville on a crisp October morning, the mountains surrounding the airport ablaze with autumn colors that belied the darkness we were there to confront. Mason had arranged for an unmarked SUV, and we drove the winding roads to Black Mountain in silence, each of us reviewing the case files one last time. The town itself seemed pulled from a postcard, historic buildings lining a quaint main street, local shops with hand-painted signs, and residents who offered friendly nods as we passed. But beneath this veneer of small-town charm, I could sense the tension. Store owners watched customers with suspicious eyes. Parents kept children close. The forest that surrounded the town, usually a tourist draw this time of year, stood strangely empty of hikers. Sheriff Davis met us at the local station, a single-story brick building that housed the town's modest police force. He and Mason embraced briefly. They had served together years before in some capacity neither ever fully explained. "I can't tell you how glad I am you're here," Davis said, leading us to a back room where maps and photos covered the walls. "We're out of our depth, and people are scared. 3 more residents have packed up and left town this week alone." The sheriff pulled down a topographical map of the surrounding wilderness. Red pins marked disappearance locations. Blue pins indicated where bodies had been recovered. As Mason had noted in our briefing, they formed a rough circle around an area locally known as Devil's Hollow. "Locals have stories about that place going back generations," Davis explained, his finger tracing the outline of the hollow. "Most dismissed it as superstition, myself included. But whatever's out there—" He paused, swallowing hard. "The bodies we found were torn apart, not like a bear or mountain lion, more deliberate." He pulled out photos I hadn't seen in our briefing packet. The images showed dismemberment patterns that were horrifically methodical. Limbs arranged in geometrical patterns, organs extracted with surgical precision. I'd seen similar configurations before, in cases involving entities that displayed rudimentary, ritualistic behavior. "We're telling the public it's a rogue bear," Davis continued, his voice dropping. "But my deputy quit last week after seeing the 3rd victim, said no animal he knows could do that." Mason studied the map, his expression grave. "We'll need a base of operations, somewhere private but close to the hollow." Davis nodded. "I've got a hunting cabin my family owns. It's been vacant since my father passed. No one will bother you there, and it's about 2 miles from the edge of the hollow." As we prepared to leave, Sarah analyzed the cellular signal strength in the area, while Logan examined weather forecasts and terrain maps. I stepped outside with Mason for a private word. "What aren't you telling me about this place?" I asked quietly. Mason's jaw tightened. "Division archives have a file on Black Mountain from 1954, classified beyond our usual protocols. I couldn't access the details, but it was flagged with containment failure status." My stomach dropped. Containment failure was our organization's euphemism for operations where agents were lost and the entity remained at large. "You think it's the same thing?" I asked. "I think," Mason replied, watching as Davis loaded our equipment into the SUV, "that this town has seen this before, and whatever happened last time, the division couldn't stop it." The cabin sat nestled among towering pines, its wooden exterior weathered by decades of mountain seasons. A wraparound porch offered views of the surrounding forest, though the beauty was diminished by our knowledge of what potentially lurked within it. Inside, the space was surprisingly well maintained. 2 bedrooms, a large main room with a stone fireplace, and a kitchen with dated but functional appliances. Sarah immediately claimed the dining table for her equipment, establishing communication links with headquarters and setting up our monitoring systems. Logan began organizing our tactical gear while Mason and I surveyed the perimeter. "The locals avoid Devil's Hollow," Mason said as we walked the property line. "But Davis says teenagers occasionally dare each other to venture in. None of the victims were local kids, though, all outsiders or newer residents. Suggesting whatever's out there knows who belongs and who doesn't," I noted. "Or the locals know better than to enter its territory." As darkness fell, we gathered around Sarah's digital map projection. Our mission parameters were clear: identify the entity, assess the threat level, contain or neutralize if possible, and minimize public awareness. "Tomorrow, we begin reconnaissance," Mason said, his voice steady and authoritative. "We move in pairs. Sarah with Logan to the northeastern quadrant, Ulysses with me to the northwest. We establish sensor perimeters and gather environmental data." None of us mentioned the unspoken reality that division reconnaissance missions often served as bait to draw out the very predators we hunted. That night, as the others slept, I stood on the porch staring into the darkness beyond our floodlights. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No owls called, no nocturnal creatures rustled in the underbrush. just the soft whisper of wind through pine needles and the persistent feeling that something was watching, waiting, assessing our presence with a calculating intelligence. I'd felt this before, this weight of malevolent observation. It never preceded anything good. Morning arrived with a heavy mist that clung to the forest floor, transforming the landscape into something from a Gothic painting. We ate in silence, each mentally preparing for what lay ahead. Sarah checked her tablet, reviewing the data collected by her perimeter sensors overnight. Nothing triggered the motion detectors, she reported, frowning. But the thermal imaging picked up something large moving just beyond range around 3 a.m. It circled the cabin twice before disappearing back toward the hollow. Logan's hand unconsciously moved to the hunting knife at his belt. "It's aware of us already." "It was aware before we arrived," I said, remembering the unnatural silence of the previous night. "We're in its territory now." Mason spread a map across the kitchen counter, marking our planned survey routes with a red marker. "We stick to the plan. 4-hour reconnaissance, radio check every 20 minutes. If you encounter anything at all that seems unusual, you report immediately and fall back to these rally points." He circled 3 locations equidistant from the cabin. We geared up methodically. Standard division field equipment included modified tactical vests with ceramic plating, specialized ammunition designed for various cryptid physiologies, encrypted communication devices, and environmental sensors. Each agent also carried personal items suited to their expertise: Logan's custom-made tracking kit, Sarah's handheld spectral analyzer, my ultraviolet detection equipment, and Mason's advanced targeting system. As Mason and I headed northwest, the forest seemed to close around us, the trees growing denser and more twisted the further we ventured from the cabin. The ground gradually sloped downward, the soil becoming softer, almost spongy beneath our boots. "We're entering the northeastern edge of Devil's Hollow," Mason confirmed, checking his GPS. "Geological surveys show this whole area sits atop an underground stream system." The atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive as we descended deeper into the hollow. Sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, creating dappled patterns that seemed to shift and move even when the branches above remained still. The air felt heavier, carrying a faint metallic scent that caught in the back of my throat. "You smell that?" I asked Mason. He nodded, his expression grim. "Blood. Old blood." We followed the scent to a small clearing where the vegetation had been flattened in a perfect circle, approximately 20 feet in diameter. The ground at the center was stained dark, and fragments of what appeared to be bone were scattered throughout the matted grass. Mason crouched, examining the scene without touching anything. "This isn't recent. These stains have weathered at least 2 rainfalls." I circled the perimeter, noting how precisely the vegetation had been compressed. This wasn't random animal activity. The circumference is too exact. Using a sterile collection kit, I gathered samples of the stained soil and bone fragments, carefully labeling each for Sarah to analyze later. Mason photographed the scene from multiple angles, his movements efficient and practiced. "Radio check with the others," I suggested, feeling increasingly uneasy in the clearing. Mason activated his communication device. "Team 2, status report." Static crackled for several seconds before Sarah's voice came through, distorted but understandable. "We're approximately 2 miles east of your position. Logan's found something unusual, tracks leading to a cave system not marked on our maps." "What kind of tracks?" Mason asked, his body tensing. "Nothing I've ever seen," Logan's voice broke through. "Bipedal, but with a stride length suggesting something larger than human. Clawed. And they appear and disappear randomly, as if whatever made them can phase in and out of solid ground." Mason and I exchanged glances. Phasing entities were rare and particularly dangerous, able to appear suddenly without warning. "Document, but do not follow into the cave," Mason ordered. "We'll regroup at the cabin in 2 hours to compare findings." As we prepared to leave the clearing, a sound stopped us both. A low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive heartbeat emanating from beneath the forest floor. It continued for precisely 30 seconds before stopping abruptly, leaving an absence more disturbing than the sound itself. "We need to move," Mason said quietly, his hand moving to his sidearm. We maintained a swift pace back through the forest, both hyper-aware of our surroundings. Twice, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, something dark and fluid sliding between distant trees. But each time I turned, nothing was there. The cabin came into view just as the sun began its descent behind the mountains. Sarah and Logan had already returned, their expressions tense as they helped us secure the perimeter. Inside, we laid out our findings. Sarah's analysis of the soil samples revealed traces of human DNA from multiple individuals, along with an unidentified organic compound that didn't match anything in our database. Logan's plaster casts of the tracks showed a foot structure that combined human and feline characteristics, with claws that extended nearly 3 inches from the toes. "The locals have a name for what they think lives in these woods," Logan said, placing a small worn book on the table. "I found this in town this morning before we left. It's a collection of regional folklore compiled in the 1930s. He opened to a marked page featuring a crude illustration of a tall, emaciated figure with elongated limbs and a featureless face. The caption read, "The Hollow Walker, said to emerge from Devil's Hollow during times of strife to claim those who trespass on its domain." Folklore often contains kernels of truth, Mason noted, studying the illustration. But I've never encountered an entity matching this description in division records. Sarah's tablet chimed, interrupting our discussion. "Proximity alert," she announced, moving to her monitor display. Something triggered the sensors 100 yards north of the cabin. We moved into defensive positions, dimming the lights and readying our weapons. Through the reinforced windows, the forest had grown completely dark, the nighttime shadows seeming to pulsate with unnatural density. "Movement, 10 o'clock, Logan whispered, his enhanced night vision goggles scanning the tree line. I followed his gaze, adjusting my own optics to compensate for the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, it was there. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, its proportions wrong in ways that defied anatomical logic. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with limbs too long and joints that bent in impossible directions. Its skin, if it could be called that, seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a silhouette of perfect darkness against the night. "Dear God," Sarah breathed beside me. The figure remained motionless for precisely 60 seconds, as if evaluating our presence. Then it tilted its head at an angle no human neck could achieve, and stepped backward into the forest, disappearing instantly. "It didn't trigger the motion sensors when it left," Sarah said, checking her tablet with trembling hands. "That's not possible. It would have had to cross the perimeter." "Unless it didn't leave physically," I suggested, the implications chilling me. "Unless it phased out, just like the tracks Logan found." Mason made the decision we'd all been considering. "We contact headquarters for backup. This entity's capabilities exceed our containment protocols." When he attempted to establish a secure communication link, however, we discovered all external signals were being blocked by an unknown interference. We were isolated, cut off from division support, with something hunting us that defied our understanding of physical laws. "We need to reconsider our approach," Mason said, his calm voice belying the gravity of our situation. "This isn't reconnaissance anymore. It's survival." Dawn arrived with an unnatural fog that clung to the windows of the cabin, so thick it obscured the world beyond our walls. None of us had slept much after the previous night's encounter, taking shifts to monitor the perimeter sensors that had remained stubbornly silent despite what we'd seen. "I've analyzed the data from last night," Sarah said, dark circles under her eyes as she showed us her findings. There was a localized electromagnetic pulse just before the entity appeared, and another when it vanished. Whatever this thing is, it's generating enough energy to disrupt our communications and possibly bend light around itself. Logan paced the small kitchen, his usual stoic demeanor fractured by nervous energy. The tracks I found lead to a cave system that might explain the disappearances. If it's dragging victims underground, we need to locate its lair. Mason considered this, his expression calculating. Going underground with an entity that can move through solid matter would be suicide with our current resources. We need to force it into a position where its advantages are minimized. I studied the topographical map, focusing on the circular pattern of disappearances. It's territorial. The attacks form a perimeter around its hunting ground. What if we're thinking about this backward? What if Devil's Hollow isn't where it lives, but what it's protecting? Mason leaned over the map, following my reasoning. Something at the center of the hollow that it guards. That would explain the ritualistic arrangement of the bodies. They're warnings, not feeding patterns. Or offerings, Logan suggested grimly. We formulated a new plan. Instead of hunting the entity directly, we would approach the center of Devil's Hollow to discover what it was protecting. Mason and I would make the approach while Sarah maintained communication from the cabin, and Logan established a secure extraction route. As we prepared to depart, I noticed Sarah discreetly loading a specialized division weapon we called a pulse disruptor, a last resort device designed to temporarily destabilize the molecular cohesion of phasing entities. The fact that she'd brought one suggested she'd suspected what we might encounter from the beginning. Headquarters briefed you separately, didn't they? I asked quietly, while Mason and Logan checked the perimeter. She hesitated before answering. They have suspicions about what's happening here based on historical patterns. They didn't want to bias the field assessment with speculation. That's not protocol, I noted, feeling a flare of frustration at being kept in the dark. This entity has been encountered before, she admitted. Not just in the 50s. Records show similar disappearance patterns in 1897, 1954, and 1987. Each time the division or its predecessors attempted intervention, each time they failed. The revelation settled like ice in my stomach. Why send us in with incomplete information? Sarah's eyes met mine, her expression troubled. Because the pattern is accelerating. The intervals between emergence events are shortening. They need data, and they need it now. Before I could respond, Mason returned, signaling it was time to move out. The conversation would have to wait. But questions burned in my mind as we departed, making our way deeper into the hollow than we'd ventured before. The fog thinned as we descended, but the forest grew increasingly strange. Trees twisted into unnatural shapes, their bark blackened as if scorched. The ground beneath our feet transitioned from soil to a slick stone-like surface that resembled hardened obsidian. Small pools of standing water dotted the landscape, each perfectly circular and still as glass. Environmental contamination, Mason observed, taking readings with his handheld scanner. Radiation levels are elevated, but not immediately dangerous. We continued downward, following a natural depression in the landscape that gradually narrowed into what appeared to be a dried stream bed. The obsidian-like material grew more prevalent, forming ridges and swirls that resembled frozen liquid. This looks like volcanic glass, I said, examining the surface. But there's no volcanic activity recorded in this region. Not geological activity, Mason corrected, his voice tight. Something else generated enough heat to vitrify the soil. The stream bed led to a circular basin approximately 50 yards in diameter, entirely composed of the black glass-like substance. At its center stood a perfectly cylindrical stone column about 7 feet tall, covered in markings that resembled no language I'd ever encountered. This is it, Mason whispered, his eyes fixed on the column. This is what it's protecting. As we approached cautiously, our radios crackled to life with Sarah's voice, distorted but urgent. Movement detected. Multiple signatures converging on your position. Get out now. Before we could react, a sound rippled through the basin, the same rhythmic thumping we'd heard in the clearing, but amplified tenfold, reverberating through the ground beneath our feet. The obsidian surface began to vibrate, hairline fractures spreading outward from the column. "Back to the perimeter," Mason ordered, drawing his weapon as we retreated toward the edge of the basin. We'd made it halfway when the entity appeared, not gradually as before, but instantaneously, standing between us and our escape route. In daylight, its form was even more disturbing, a humanoid figure whose proportions shifted subtly as it moved, its skin a matte black that seemed to absorb the very light around it. Its face was smooth and featureless, except for what appeared to be a vertical slit where a mouth should be. Mason fired without hesitation, the specialized rounds designed to disrupt cryptid physiologies. The entity jerked as the bullets struck, but showed no signs of serious injury. Instead, it moved toward us with uncanny speed, covering 10 yards in a single fluid motion. "Split up," Mason shouted, diving to the right while I went left. The creature paused, its head swiveling between us before choosing to pursue Mason. I fired repeatedly at its back, trying to distract it. But it moved with singular purpose, closing the distance to Mason in seconds. What happened next occurred so quickly I could barely process it. Mason fired again, the bullets striking the entity's chest. It seemed to ripple, and then its arm extended impossibly, crossing the space between them in a blur. Claws that hadn't been visible before slashed across Mason's torso, tearing through his tactical vest as if it were paper. Mason stumbled backward, blood spreading across his chest, but maintained his footing long enough to pull a phosphorus flare from his belt. He ignited it, the brilliant white light causing the entity to recoil momentarily. "The column!" Mason shouted, his voice strained with pain. "Destroy the column!" I ran toward the stone structure, drawing my combat knife infused with silver and iron alloys, materials that had proven effective against various cryptid physiologies. Behind me, I heard Mason's continued gunfire, then a terrible wet sound and his abrupt silence. The column's surface felt strangely warm beneath my hands, the alien markings seeming to shift and move as I touched them. I drove my knife into what appeared to be a central symbol, applying my full strength. The blade sank in with unexpected ease, and a high-pitched keening filled the air. The entire basin shuddered, and the black surface beneath my feet began to liquefy. I turned to see the entity standing over Mason's motionless form, its featureless face now split by a gaping vertical maw lined with needle-like teeth. It noticed my action and moved toward me with terrifying speed. But before it could reach me, the ground between us erupted. 3 more identical entities emerged from the liquefying obsidian, surrounding me in a perfect triangle formation. My radio crackled again with Logan's voice. "Ulysses, we're coming in. Hold position." Before I could respond, one of the entities lunged. I dodged, but another was already behind me, its elongated fingers wrapping around my arm with crushing strength. The skin where it touched burned like acid, and I felt a strange numbness spreading from the contact point. In desperation, I activated a UV flash grenade, a standard tool against creatures with photosensitivity. The basin filled with blinding ultraviolet light, and the effect was immediate. The entities released inhuman screams, their skin blistering and smoking where the light touched them. I broke free and ran toward Mason, grabbing his body and dragging him toward the edge of the basin. The entities recovered quickly, pursuing us with fury, now replacing their earlier methodical movements. Just as they closed in, gunfire erupted from the ridge above the basin. Logan and Sarah had arrived, providing covering fire from elevated positions. Sarah deployed the pulse disruptor, the device emitting concentric waves of energy that caused the entities to flicker like faulty television signals. "The column!" I shouted up to them. "We need to destroy it completely." Logan nodded, retrieving something from his pack, a division-issued demolition charge. He calibrated it quickly before tossing it down to me. I caught it and turned back toward the column, which was now pulsating with an internal light that cast sickly green shadows across the basin. The entities seemed aware of my intention, their movements becoming frenzied as they attempted to reach me through the disruption field. One partially materialized through the ground directly in front of me, its half-formed body writhing as the pulse disruptor tore at its molecular structure. I sidestepped its flailing limbs and reached the column, placing the charge at its base and activating the timer for 30 seconds. The countdown began as I retreated, supporting Mason's limp form as best I could, while Sarah and Logan continued their suppressing fire. We had just cleared the ridge when the charge detonated. The explosion was strangely muted, as if the sound were being absorbed, but the shockwave that followed knocked us all off our feet. A column of greenish light shot upward from where the stone had stood, piercing the clouds above before collapsing back in upon itself. The screams that followed weren't like anything I'd heard before. Not just the entities in the basin, but a chorus of inhuman voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The forest around us shuddered, trees bending toward the hollow as if caught in a powerful wind. And then, silence, absolute and complete. Mason lay still beside me, his chest barely rising with shallow breaths. Blood soaked through his tactical vest, but he was alive, barely. Logan helped me lift him while Sarah covered our retreat. The pulse disruptor held ready, though no further entities appeared. As we made our way back toward the cabin, I glanced back at Devil's Hollow. The unnatural fog was lifting, and for a moment I thought I saw the outline of something massive beneath the forest floor. A geometric shape too perfect to be natural, too alien to be human construction. Then the tree shifted, and it was gone. Mason had been right. This wasn't just a hunting ground for a cryptid predator. It was something older, something that had been here long before the town of Black Mountain existed, and we had disturbed it. We reached the cabin as dusk settled over the mountains, the fading light casting long shadows through the trees. Mason's condition had deteriorated during our retreat. His breathing labored, skin ashen beneath the blood and dirt. Whatever the entity had done to him went beyond physical injury. There was a spreading darkness beneath his skin that followed the veins outward from the wound. Sarah converted the dining table into a makeshift medical station, applying field trauma protocols while Logan secured the perimeter. I contacted Sheriff Davis on our emergency radio frequency, requesting immediate medical evacuation while deliberately omitting the nature of our encounter. "I'll have a helicopter at the clearing a mile north of your position in 40 minutes, Davis responded, his voice tight with concern. "Will you tell me what the hell happened out there?" The whole town felt that, whatever it was, knocked out power across the county. "Prepare for casualties," I replied, avoiding his question. "And Sheriff, don't let anyone near Devil's Hollow. Not your deputies, not search and rescue. No one." While we waited for evacuation, Sarah's analysis of Mason's condition confirmed my fears. The wound isn't responding to any standard treatments. There's some kind of foreign cellular material spreading through his system, almost like a parasitic infection, but it's not behaving like any pathogen I've ever seen. I studied the obsidian-like material I'd collected from the hollow, now contained in a division-issue isolation case. Under Sarah's portable microscope, the substance revealed a crystalline structure that periodically shifted and realigned itself without any apparent stimulus. "It's still active," I noted, watching the microscopic movements, even separated from the source. Logan joined us, his expression grim. "Perimeter sensors are all clear, but the electromagnetic disturbance is increasing. Whatever we disrupted down there is still reacting." Sarah adjusted Mason's IV, her hands steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. "The column, what do you think it was? A containment structure? A communication device? Or a plug?" I suggested, the terrible possibility forming in my mind. What if Devil's Hollow isn't just a name? What if it's exactly what it sounds like, a hollow space beneath the mountain, and that column was keeping something from coming through? Before anyone could respond, Mason's eyes flew open, his body arching in sudden rigidity. When he spoke, his voice carried a harmonic distortion that raised the hair on my arms. "The gate stands open," he said, the words seeming to echo though he barely whispered. "The sleepers wake. You've broken the seal." His hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. Where his skin touched mine, I felt a cold that penetrated to the bone, and with it came flashes of imagery. The hollow from below, a vast chamber filled with symmetrical structures of the same obsidian material, and within them shapes that shifted and moved with alien geometries. Logan pulled Mason's hand away, breaking the connection. Mason collapsed back onto the table, unconscious again but now trembling violently. "He's been compromised," Logan said quietly, his hand moving to his sidearm. "Division protocol is clear for contamination scenarios." "No." I stepped between them, though I knew Logan was right. Protocol dictated that personnel showing signs of cryptid infection or possession were to be neutralized immediately to prevent further spread. We get him to the evacuation point. The medical team can establish containment. Sarah's tablet chimed with an urgent alert. Seismic activity beneath Devil's Hollow. Multiple tremors registering at increasing intervals. Outside, the forest had gone silent again. That same unnatural quiet we'd experienced on our first night, but deeper now, as if the entire mountain were holding its breath. "We move now," I decided, gathering our essential equipment. "Whatever's happening, we need to be clear of this area when it escalates." We fashioned a stretcher for Mason from blankets and curtain rods, securing him as best we could before heading out into the gathering darkness. The hike to the evacuation point would take approximately 30 minutes at our current pace, burdened as we were with Mason's unconscious form. The forest had changed since our arrival. Trees that had stood for centuries now leaned at unnatural angles, their roots partially exposed as if the soil beneath had shifted. The ground itself felt unstable, subtly vibrating beneath our boots. Most disturbing were the shadows, deeper than natural darkness should allow, pooling in hollows and depressions, with an almost liquid quality. We had covered perhaps half the distance to the evacuation point when Mason began convulsing again, his body twisting against the restraints we'd placed to secure him to the stretcher. His eyes opened, revealing pupils that had expanded to consume the iris entirely, and the veins in his neck and face stood out in stark relief, pulsing with that same darkness we'd observed earlier. "It comes," he gasped, his voice still carrying that unnatural harmonic. "The gateway between, the space between spaces. You invited it." Logan and I struggled to hold the stretcher steady as Mason's convulsions intensified. Sarah administered a sedative from our medical kit, but it seemed to have no effect. "We need to keep moving," I insisted, though Logan's expression clearly indicated his growing conviction that Mason was beyond saving. Suddenly, Mason went completely still. His eyes, still unnaturally black, fixed on a point somewhere above and beyond us. We all instinctively followed his gaze upward. The night sky had changed. Where stars should have been visible between the canopy gaps, there was instead a shifting, folding darkness that seemed to bend and distort the very fabric of space. As we watched, transfixed, a vertical line appeared in this darkness. Not a tear or a hole, but a deliberate parting, like massive eyelids opening to reveal something beyond. "Run," Mason whispered, his voice suddenly his own again, filled with desperate urgency. "Ulysses, get them out. It's not just one entity, it's a colony, a hive, and the Queen is coming through." Before I could respond, the ground beneath us heaved violently, sending us all sprawling. The stretcher overturned, and Mason was thrown several feet away, landing heavily against a tree trunk. Logan recovered first, pulling Sarah to her feet, while I scrambled toward Mason. What happened next remains fragmented in my memory, like pieces of a nightmare that my mind refuses to assemble into a coherent whole. The earth between Mason and me split open, a fissure appearing that widened with frightening speed. From within this opening emerged not one entity but dozens, smaller versions of what we'd encountered in the hollow, their bodies flowing up from the depths like liquid darkness given form. Mason met my eyes one last time across the growing chasm, a moment of perfect clarity amidst the chaos. "The column was a warning, not a prison," he called out. "They've been here all along, beneath us, waiting." Then the entities reached him, surrounding his prone form in a writhing mass of elongated limbs and featureless faces. I drew my weapon, firing blindly into the swarm, but they moved with that same impossible physics, bullets passing through spaces where they should have been, only to find emptiness. "Ulysses!" Logan shouted from behind me, firing his own weapon at entities that had begun to emerge from other fissures opening throughout the forest floor. "We need to move now." The rational part of my mind knew he was right, knew that Mason was already lost. But some deeper instinct refused to abandon him. I continued forward, leaping across the narrowest part of the chasm separating us. I landed heavily on the other side, rolling to absorb the impact, and came up firing at the nearest entities. They recoiled from the specialized ammunition, but there were too many, and my magazine emptied too quickly. As I reached to reload, one of them moved with that blurring speed, appearing directly before me. Up close, its facial slit parted to reveal not just teeth, but a complex arrangement of pulsating membranes that emitted a high-frequency sound that disoriented me instantly. My vision swam, balance failing as the sound penetrated deeper than my ears, seeming to resonate within my skull itself. Through the disorientation, I saw Mason's body begin to change, his form elongating, joints bending at impossible angles as the darkness spread across his skin completely. What rose from the ground where he had lain was no longer human, but a hybrid abomination, his features still recognizable but distorted, as if his body were merely a vessel being worn by something else. The Mason thing turned toward me, the movement fluid and wrong, and spoke with a voice that layered Mason's familiar tones over something ancient and cold. "The division between worlds was always thinner here. Your interference has ruptured it completely. They come now, all of them." I felt hands grabbing me from behind. Logan and Sarah had crossed the chasm to retrieve me. The entity that had been Mason made no move to stop us as they dragged me backward, away from the spreading swarm of smaller entities that continued to pour from the earth. "The helicopter," Sarah gasped, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "It's waiting. We need to go." As we retreated, I saw other figures emerging from the trees, townspeople, their movements jerky and uncoordinated, eyes reflecting the same complete blackness we'd seen in Mason. They didn't pursue us, instead converging on the largest fissure where the Mason thing stood like a sentinel. We reached the evacuation point, a small clearing now illuminated by the searchlight of a waiting helicopter. Sheriff Davis himself stood at the edge of the clearing, shotgun in hand, watching the forest with evident terror. "What the hell did you people do?" he shouted over the roar of the rotors as we approached. "The whole mountain's coming apart." Indeed, behind us, the landscape was transforming. Trees toppled as the ground continued to heave and split. The unnatural darkness in the sky had spread, now covering the entire visible firmament above Devil's Hollow. We boarded the helicopter without answering, and as it lifted off, I watched through the side window as the transformation accelerated. The forest canopy began to collapse inward, trees and earth disappearing into a growing depression that rapidly expanded outward from the center of Devil's Hollow. The last thing I saw before we banked away was the Mason thing standing at the edge of this growing abyss, its head tilted upward toward the rent in the sky, arms extended in a gesture of welcoming give, or supplication, to whatever was descending from that impossible darkness. The official report classified the Black Mountain incident as a geological event, a localized sinkhole formation resulting from previously undetected limestone caverns beneath the mountain. The town was evacuated under the pretense of environmental hazards, the area quarantined by agencies whose acronyms conveyed authority without transparency. Division cleanup teams moved in within hours, establishing a containment perimeter that extended 3 miles in every direction from the center of Devil's Hollow. Satellite imagery of the region was scrubbed and replaced with composite visuals that showed nothing more alarming than standard forest recovery from a natural disaster. 3 weeks after our extraction, I sat in a sterile debriefing room at Division headquarters, recounting the events for the fifth time to a panel of senior officials whose expressions revealed nothing of their thoughts. Sarah and Logan had been similarly debriefed, then reassigned to separate units, standard procedure for teams that experienced catastrophic mission failure. "Agent Mercer," the senior official addressed me, her tone carefully neutral. "Your report indicates that Captain Briggs was compromised by an entity of unknown origin, yet you delayed neutralization protocols. Do you stand by this decision?" "I do," I answered, my voice steady despite the exhaustion that had become my constant companion since Black Mountain. At that point, we still believed evacuation and containment were viable options. What I couldn't say within the confines of official reporting, was how Mason's eyes had found mine in that last moment of humanity, silently pleading for me to get the others to safety rather than attempt a futile rescue. Some debts can't be paid in full, only honored through the protection of others. The debriefing concluded with my reassignment to non-field duties pending psychological evaluation, a bureaucratic euphemism for being shelved until they determined whether the experience had broken me beyond repair. In the months that followed, I observed from a distance as the division implemented what they called the Black Mountain Protocol, a systematic approach to studying and containing the phenomenon that had emerged there. Monitoring stations established around the perimeter reported continuous electromagnetic and gravitational anomalies emanating from the center of the former hollow, now a perfect circular depression, nearly a mile in diameter, and of indeterminate depth. Unmanned drones sent into the depression never returned. Remote sensing equipment failed within minutes of deployment. The only data that consistently transmitted were audio recordings, capturing that same rhythmic thumping we'd heard in the forest, now amplified 100-fold and maintaining a precise cadence day and night without variation. Official division theory classified what we'd encountered as a previously unknown form of invasive, extra-dimensional entity, a hive organism capable of existing partially in our reality, while maintaining its primary mass in another dimensional plane. The column we'd destroyed was theorized to be an ancient containment mechanism, possibly constructed by previous human civilizations who had encountered the entity and managed to restrict its access to our reality. I knew the truth was both simpler and more terrifying. We hadn't just encountered something alien. We had awakened something that had always been there, something that existed in the spaces between conventional reality, perceiving our world as we might perceive a two-dimensional drawing. The entities weren't invading, they were emerging, like fingers pushing through the surface of a pond to test the air above. 6 months after Black Mountain, I was cleared for limited field duty and assigned to the Historical Research Division, a lateral move that kept me involved while limiting my direct contact with active operations. My new role involved examining historical records for patterns matching what we now called hollow-type entities, searching for previous encounters throughout human history. What I found disturbed me deeply. Cave paintings dating back 30,000 years depicted elongated figures with featureless faces. Medieval manuscripts described men of shadow who walked through walls and stole children during times of plague. Native American tribal histories spoke of thin places in the landscape where the boundary between worlds wore thin, and guardians were appointed to maintain ritual structures that kept the hungry ones at bay. Most significantly, I discovered that Black Mountain wasn't unique. Similar geological formations existed worldwide, each surrounded by historical patterns of disappearances and strange phenomena occurring in roughly 70-year cycles. Many of these locations featured ancient stone structures reminiscent of the column we'd encountered, objects described in local folklore as seals or locks or binding stones. I compiled my findings into a comprehensive report and submitted it through official channels, expecting the bureaucratic inertia that typically greeted theoretical research. Instead, I was summoned to a secure meeting with the division director herself, a woman I had met only once before, during my initial recruitment. Your report has been classified beyond standard protocols, she informed me without preamble as I sat across from her desk. The correlation between these sites and our current monitoring data is concerning. She activated a holographic display showing a global map with pulsing red dots indicating the locations I'd identified in my research. Superimposed over these were real-time waveform analyses from each site, all showing the same rhythmic pattern we'd recorded at Black Mountain, perfectly synchronized despite thousands of miles of separation. They're communicating, I said, the realization settling like ice in my stomach. Or resonating, the director corrected, like tuning forks vibrating at the same frequency. We believe what happened at Black Mountain triggered a sympathetic response in these other locations. The containment structures at these sites are showing signs of degradation at an accelerating rate. She deactivated the display and fixed me with an evaluating gaze. We're forming specialized teams to assess and reinforce these structures before they fail completely. Your experience with these entities makes you uniquely qualified to lead one such team. With all due respect, Director, my last encounter with these entities resulted in the loss of my team leader and the compromise of an entire geographic region. Which is precisely why you won't underestimate them again, she countered. We need field agents who understand what we're facing, who have seen it firsthand and still maintained enough psychological stability to function. I considered declining, using my pending retirement as an excuse. But the images from that night in the forest haunted me still. Mason's transformation, the tear in the sky, the sense of ancient patience finally rewarded. If similar events were poised to occur globally, retirement would offer no sanctuary. I'll need to select my own team, I said finally, and full access to all historical data on previous encounters, not just the sanitized reports. The director nodded, sliding a secure tablet across the desk. You'll find dossiers on recommended personnel. Your authorization level has been upgraded to access all relevant historical files, including those predating the division's formation. As I left her office, tablet in hand, I felt a weight settling onto my shoulders. The responsibility not just for my future team, but for the barriers between our world and whatever existed beyond them. I understood now why the division had sent us to Black Mountain, despite the historical failures. Some threats cannot be ignored, only confronted, even when victory seems impossible. That night, in my Spartan Division apartment, I reviewed the personnel files, searching for individuals with the unique combination of skills and psychological resilience necessary for our task. Sarah's name appeared among the candidates, her technological expertise noted as essential for the monitoring systems we would need to establish. Logan was conspicuously absent, his post-Black Mountain evaluation having revealed deeper trauma than he had initially displayed. As I worked, I found myself occasionally glancing at the shadows in the corners of my room, half expecting them to deepen and shift. The entities had changed something fundamental in my perception, or perhaps had merely revealed what had always been there, just beyond the edge of human awareness. I still dream of Mason sometimes, not as the twisted thing he became at the end, but as he was during our years working together. In these dreams, he stands at the edge of a great darkness, neither advancing nor retreating, but maintaining a vigilant watch. Perhaps it's my mind's way of processing loss, or perhaps something of him remains intact, even in whatever form he now exists. The Black Mountain incident officially remains a containment failure in division records, but I've come to see it differently. We didn't fail to contain the entity. We simply discovered that containment was always a temporary measure against something that operates on a time scale beyond human comprehension. The column in Devil's Hollow had stood for centuries, perhaps millennia, maintaining a barrier that was always destined to weaken. Our new mission isn't to defeat these entities, that may be impossible given their nature, but to understand the ancient methods that kept them at bay for generations and adapt those techniques with modern technology. It's a holding action, buying time for humanity to prepare for a reality where the boundaries between dimensions are more permeable than we ever imagined. Tomorrow, I begin assembling my team. We'll start with the site in northern Finland, where local authorities have reported increasing seismic activity and unexplained disappearances near a prehistoric stone arrangement deep within the Arctic Circle. The pattern matches Black Mountain too closely to ignore, and satellite imagery shows the characteristic circular depression beginning to form. I've requested Division Archives send all available information on the region's folklore, particularly stories involving thin places or entities that move between worlds. I've also requisitioned specialized equipment based on Sarah's designs, improved versions of the pulse disruptor that temporarily affected the entities at Black Mountain. As I prepare for this next mission, I carry the weight of what I know, that beneath the orderly surface of our reality, there exists a vast network of hollow spaces where something ancient and patient waits. The seals that kept them contained are failing simultaneously across the globe, and the Division, for all its resources and knowledge, is merely buying time against an inevitable emergence. Yet I continue because someone must stand at the edge of that darkness. Someone must remember Mason's sacrifice and the lessons of Black Mountain. Someone must carry the torch of human resistance against forces that existed before humanity drew its first breath, and will likely remain long after our species is dust. My name is Ulysses Mercer. I work for a covert division under the U.S. government, tasked with investigating and neutralizing cryptid threats. But more than that, I am a sentinel at the boundary between worlds, bearing witness to the shadows that grow deeper with each passing day, preparing for the moment when the hollow places beneath our feet can no longer be ignored. The division calls us Hollow Hunters, but the truth is far more complex. We aren't the hunters. We're just the first line of defense in a war most of humanity doesn't even know is coming. I found the first footprints on a Tuesday. They weren't mine, too narrow, with a distinct tread pattern I'd never seen before. They circled my cabin, stopping beneath each window, lingering near the back door where the lock was weakest. But I should start from the beginning. My name is Mark Henderson, and what I'm about to tell you happened back in the summer of 2002, when I was living off the grid in a makeshift cabin near Lake Lure, North Carolina. I'd moved there after years of city life, craving quiet days and no landlords breathing down my neck. I'd built a small shack out of old plywood and scavenged beams right off a dirt path about a half-mile from the water's edge. You wouldn't call it fancy, but it was enough for me. A cot, a table, a wood-burning stove, and a few tools I had picked up cheap from a flea market in Asheville. I'd grown up in Baltimore with too many people telling me what to do. Here, I figured I could just be myself, catch my own fish, grow a few vegetables, and get some peace. Most folks around Lake Lure found me odd, but friendly enough. I'd even learned to make simple jokes about my scraggly beard and the way my clothes never fit right. I like to say I dressed from the reject bin of goodwill, and that got a laugh more than once. I was comfortable being the weird guy down the road who minded his own business. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The forest's constant whisper had become as natural to me as my own breathing. Each morning, I'd wake to dappled sunlight filtering through the single window above my cot, dust motes dancing in the beams. The floorboards creaked with familiar voices, each one a friend I'd come to know during long winter nights when the temperature dropped low enough to make the wood contract and settle. I spent my days hauling water from a nearby spring, chopping wood, checking my tomato plants, and trying to keep my radio antenna straight so I could catch a few stations at night. The place was thick with pines and oaks, and in the morning, I'd hear distant boat motors hum on the lake. Every now and then, I'd see a tourist couple passing on the gravel track, sometimes waving, sometimes just hurrying past as if unsure about me. My routine was simple but fulfilling. I'd wake at dawn, stoke the embers in my stove, and boil water for coffee. The first gulp always burned my tongue, but I welcomed the sensation. A reminder that I was alive, present in my body. I'd check my small garden plot, pulling weeds and inspecting the vegetables for signs of deer or rabbit intrusion. By midday, I'd hike to the lake, spending hours with my fishing line cast into the clear water. Some days I caught nothing. Other days I'd fry up bass or trout over an open flame, the sizzle of fish skin against hot metal, a symphony to my ears. I liked being off-grid because it spared me the awkward small talk, but I still had my moments of chat with some locals. There was a guy named Ray Sanchez who worked at jobs fixing docks and fences, and he'd stop by on his ATV once in a while, trading a beer for a few fresh tomatoes. He was about my age, had a sunburned neck and a slow, comforting drawl. I liked him enough. He never pried into why I lived alone, and I never asked him too many questions either. "Man's got a right to his privacy," Ray told me once, tipping his beer in a salute. "You ain't hurting nobody out here." That comment stayed with me. Before Lake Lure, my life had been a series of cramped apartments, meaningless jobs, and relationships that collapsed under their own weight. Out here, I found a certain peace in the stillness, in the absence of expectations. But solitude has its price. The human mind isn't built for complete isolation. After a few months alone, I started talking to myself, quiet mutterings at first, then full conversations. I'd debate politics with an empty chair, or describe my day to the squirrels that darted through my yard. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I'd wake with the distinct feeling someone had called my name. Maybe that's why I ignored the first signs. Maybe I was so accustomed to the tricks of a lonely mind that I dismissed the evidence right in front of me. It began with small things. A cooking pot moved from its hook. My axe found 10 yards from where I last placed it. Footprints in the soft earth that vanished into the tree line. I rationalized each instance. I must have moved the pot and forgotten. The axe could have fallen and rolled. The footprints were probably my own from days earlier. One hot afternoon in late July, I was clearing brush, sweat soaking through my shirt, when I spotted something unmistakable behind my shack near the tree line. A set of footprints that definitely didn't match my boots. Someone had been creeping around while I was away. I crouched down, ran my fingertips over the dry leaves and checked the pattern. The soles were thin, maybe athletic shoes, and whoever it was had stepped carefully, avoiding the patches of mud that would have left clearer impressions. I followed the tracks as far as I could. They circled my cabin entirely, stopping at each window, lingering at the back door with its flimsy padlock. The thought of someone watching me, studying my home while I was gone, sent a chill down my back despite the summer heat. At first, I figured it was just some hiker or a curious teen. The lake attracted plenty of tourists in summer, and some of them wandered off the marked trails. Perhaps someone had stumbled upon my cabin and, finding it empty, decided to investigate. An innocent explanation. But as twilight thickened into darkness that night, I found myself checking the lock twice, then 3 times. I pushed my single chair against the door handle for good measure. The woods had never seemed threatening before. They were my sanctuary, my escape from the world's chaos. Now, as the wind rustled through the pines and something small scurried beneath the cabin floor, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I tried to dismiss the unease as I settled onto my cot, the springs groaning beneath my weight. The radio picked up nothing but static that night, a harsh, white noise that filled the cabin like fog. I switched it off and lay in darkness, listening to the forest's nighttime chorus, crickets, frogs, the occasional hoot of an owl. Just as sleep began to tug at my consciousness, a twig snapped outside, clear and sharp, close to my window. My eyes flew open, and I held my breath, straining to hear more. For several minutes, nothing. Then the subtle crunch of leaves under careful footsteps, moving slowly around the perimeter of my cabin. Someone was out there, deliberately circling my home in the darkness. I reached under my cot and grabbed the hunting knife I kept there, its wooden handle smooth and reassuring in my palm. The footsteps paused outside my window, and I could sense someone standing there, perhaps peering through the glass at my still form. I remained motionless, knife clutched to my chest, heart hammering so loudly I was certain whoever stood outside must hear it. Minutes stretched like hours. Eventually, the footsteps retreated, fading into the forest's ambient sounds until I couldn't distinguish them anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I sat upright on my cot, knife in hand, watching the square of window gradually lighten as dawn approached. When morning finally came, I searched the area around my cabin. The footprints were clearer now, definitely not mine. Smaller, narrower, with a distinct tread pattern. They had indeed circled my entire cabin, stopping at each window, spending extra time at the back door where my lock was weakest. As I stood in the clearing, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, a new feeling settled in my chest, a cold certainty that something had changed. My sanctuary had been violated. The solitude I'd cherished now felt ominous, pregnant with threat. I was no longer alone in these woods. As the days rolled on, I started feeling like I had eyes on me constantly. The sensation would creep up my spine while I worked in my garden or collected firewood. That unmistakable awareness of being watched. I'd spin around, searching the forest's edge, but never caught more than a shadow slipping between trees, there and gone so quickly, I questioned if I'd seen anything at all. At night, I'd hear twigs snapping outside. Sometimes a branch would scrape against my window, too deliberate to be the wind. I took to sleeping with my hunting knife under my pillow and the hatchet beside my cot. Sleep became shallow, fractured by every sound from the darkness outside. A week after finding those first footprints, I discovered my fishing gear missing. I kept my rod, tackle box, and a few handmade lures on the small covered porch. The first time they disappeared, I cursed at my own forgetfulness, thinking I'd left them at the lake or moved them inside and forgotten. I spent hours retracing my steps, searching every corner of my cabin, convinced I'd simply misplaced them. But the next morning, the gear was back on the porch, arranged exactly as I always kept it. Except the line on my reel had been cut and retied with knots I never used, and one of my favorite lures was missing. Someone had taken my things, used them, and returned them deliberately altered. The second time my fishing gear vanished, I knew someone was messing with me. This time, only the tackle box disappeared. 3 days later, I found it hanging from a tree branch 30 yards into the forest, several hooks removed and the rest rearranged in perfect rows, grouped by size and type with an obsessive precision I found more disturbing than if they'd been destroyed. That afternoon, Ray stopped by on his ATV. The engine's rumble a welcome intrusion on the heavy silence that had settled around my cabin. He sat on a stump outside my shack, sipping a warm can of beer I'd traded him for some fresh squash. When I told him about the missing gear and the footprints, his expression changed, the easy smile disappearing from his sun-weathered face. "You ever see this guy?" he asked, his tone serious. He had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was nervous, and he did it right then. I shook my head. Just shadows, footprints, things moved or taken. Ray looked toward the woods, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the tree line. "I heard rumors," he said quietly, "about some fellow roaming around here. Not sure who he is, but folks seen him near old campsites." "What kind of rumors?" I pressed, leaning forward. Ray took a long pull from his beer, then crushed the can in his fist. "Bad ones. Campers reported stuff missing. Food, clothes, hunting knives. Park ranger found a campsite all torn up a few weeks back. Blood on the ground. No body, though." "You think it's the same person?" "Can't say." Ray looked uneasy, which put me on edge. "Just be careful, Mark. This ain't normal mischief." He finished his beer and stood to leave, brushing pine needles from his jeans. "I'm heading up north to my cousin's cabin this weekend. Coming back Tuesday. You need anything from town before I go?" I shook my head, though what I really needed was the reassurance that I wasn't alone out here with whoever was stalking the woods. Ray promised he'd come back in a few days, maybe bring his old shotgun for me to borrow. I didn't sleep easy that night. I wedged a piece of scrap metal into my front door to reinforce the latch. My heart beat a little faster than usual when I blew out my lantern. There was this feeling, like being watched from deep among the trees. I couldn't see anyone, but I heard soft movement at odd hours, the careful placement of feet trying to avoid dry leaves, the controlled breathing of someone accustomed to moving undetected. Morning brought no relief. The air felt thick with tension as I stepped onto my porch, scanning the clearing for signs of intrusion. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance. I made coffee with water I'd boiled the night before, sipping it slowly as I walked the perimeter of my property, searching for new tracks. Near the woodpile behind my cabin, I found something that made my coffee mug slip from my fingers, shattering on the rocky ground. A knife was stuck into a log stump, driven deep into the wood with considerable force. It wasn't mine. The blade looked homemade, maybe hammered out of a file or something. The handle was wrapped in electrical tape, worn smooth in places from extensive use. I approached slowly, as if the knife might suddenly animate and fly at me. The morning sun caught the edge of the blade, revealing a dark, rust-colored stain along its length. I told myself it was just corrosion, but the way it flaked off at my touch suggested otherwise. I pulled it free, the wood releasing it with reluctance. The knife felt wrong in my hand, balanced for someone else's grip, the handle too narrow for my fingers. I walked to the edge of my clearing, stared into the dense pine forest, and threw the knife as hard as I could. It tumbled end over end, disappearing into a thicket with a quiet rustle. As it landed, I caught a glimpse of movement through the branches. A tall man, shirtless, lean, and sunburned, with a shaved head and a twisted scar that ran from his right ear down to his collarbone. He wore track pants and old sneakers, his bare chest marked with strange, self-inflicted scars, rows of small parallel lines that couldn't have been accidental. He looked right at me, didn't blink, then slipped silently behind a tree. My first instinct was to run after him, to confront this intruder who'd been terrorizing me. But something in his eyes, a hollow emptiness, devoid of emotion, stopped me. I felt too stunned and honestly a bit scared. This wasn't a curious hiker or mischievous local. The way he moved, fluid and silent, reminded me of a predator. I retreated to my cabin, barricaded the door, and spent the day jumping at every sound from the forest. By evening, a plan had formed in my mind. I needed to speak with Ray again, to learn what else he knew about this stranger. Ray's cabin was about 15 minutes away by foot, closer to the main road. He wouldn't be back from his cousin's place until Tuesday, but maybe he'd left something behind. A newspaper clipping, a note, any information that might help me understand what I was dealing with. As twilight settled over the trees, I gathered my courage and ventured out. The forest took on an ominous quality in the fading light, shadows deepening into perfect hiding places for watching eyes. I moved quickly, following the narrow trail that connected our properties, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I reached the small clearing where Ray's cabin stood, something felt wrong immediately. His ATV sat flipped on its side behind the structure, one wheel still spinning slowly. The door to his cabin hung open, swaying slightly in the evening breeze. "Ray?" I called out, approaching cautiously. No answer. The silence felt heavy, unnatural. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I stepped onto the porch, wood creaking beneath my weight. "Ray, you home early?" I pushed the door wider, and the smell hit me first. A sharp metallic odor like iron and something else, something organic and wrong. My eyes took a moment to adjust to the dimness inside. Ray lay face down on the rough-hewn floorboards, one arm outstretched toward the back door, as if he'd been trying to escape. Blood pooled around his neck, soaking into the wood, already turning dark and tacky. My mouth went dry and my legs turned weak as I processed what I was seeing. I reached down, fingers trembling as I touched his wrist, checking for a pulse I knew wouldn't be there. His skin had already cooled. His throat had been cut, a single deep slash that had nearly severed his head from his body. The wound was precise, executed with practiced efficiency. I backed away, gagging, and stumbled outside, my heart hammering against my ribs. The reality of my situation crashed down on me. Ray was dead, murdered by the same scarred stranger who'd been circling my cabin for days. I had no phone, no way to call for help. The nearest neighbor might be miles away, and I wasn't even sure they'd have a phone. As I stood on Ray's porch, paralyzed by indecision, movement caught my eye at the forest's edge, a pale figure watching me from between the trees. Even at this distance, I could see his eyes, flat, emotionless, studying me with cold calculation. He didn't try to hide. He wanted me to see him, to know he was there. The stranger raised one hand, pointing directly at me. Then he drew a single finger across his throat in a slashing motion. The message couldn't have been clearer. I ran. Blind panic propelled me through the forest, branches whipping my face as I crashed through underbrush, following no path, driven only by the primal need to put distance between myself and the killer. I had no direction, no plan beyond escape. My mind flooded with images of Ray's body and the stranger's cold, predatory gaze. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I leaned against a massive oak, lungs burning, legs trembling with fatigue. The forest had grown dark around me, the last light of day fading rapidly. I had no idea where I was. The familiar landmarks were gone, and in my panic, I'd veered off any trail. As my breathing slowed, rational thought began to return. Running blindly through the woods at night was suicide. I needed shelter, weapons, and a plan. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think. My cabin was safer than the open forest. At least there I had walls, a door that locked, and my hunting knife. I oriented myself using the North Star and began the careful journey back, moving as quietly as possible, stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. Every shadow seemed to harbor the scarred man, every rustle of leaves his footsteps. The journey took twice as long as it should have, my progress slowed by caution and the need to remain silent. When I finally reached the edge of my clearing, I paused, studying my cabin from the darkness of the tree line. It appeared undisturbed, the windows dark, the door still closed. But that meant nothing. He could be inside, waiting for me. I circled the property slowly, checking for signs of intrusion. The scrap metal still wedged the door shut from the inside. He hadn't entered that way. The windows remained latched. Only after a complete circuit did I approach, slipping through the door quickly and securing it behind me. Inside, I lit a single candle, keeping it low to avoid broadcasting my presence through the windows. By its flickering light, I took inventory of my situation. I had my hunting knife, a hatchet for chopping wood, some rope, matches, a canteen of water, and a small amount of food, dried beans, jerky, and a few potatoes. Not much to sustain me, but enough for a day or two. I knew I had to leave. Ray's murder confirmed what I'd suspected. The scarred man was dangerous, possibly deranged. If he'd killed Ray, he'd have no hesitation about doing the same to me. My isolated cabin, once a sanctuary, had become a trap. The main road was about a mile away, a long, exposed walk through dark woods where he clearly knew the terrain better than I did. But staying meant certain death. At least on the road I might flag down a passing vehicle, find help at one of the tourist cabins that dotted the lakeshore. I spent that night in a state of hypervigilance, knife in hand, back against the wall, watching the door and windows for any sign of the killer. Every creak of the cabin's timbers, every whisper of wind through the pine needles outside sent adrenaline surging through my veins. Sleep was impossible. By first light, I'd made my decision. I would leave at dusk when the fading light might provide some cover, but still allow me to see my way. Moving during full daylight seemed too exposed, too obvious. I spent the day preparing, packing a small bag with essentials, hiding a few emergency supplies in my clothing, and planning my route to the main road. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across my clearing, I made final preparations. I sharpened my knife, secured the hatchet to my belt, and filled my canteen. The weight of the blade against my palm offered some comfort, though I harbored no illusions about my chances against a practiced killer. I wrote a quick note explaining what had happened, naming Ray and describing the scarred man, then tucked it into a tin can and buried it beneath my woodpile. If things went badly, perhaps someone would eventually find it. When twilight finally arrived, I stepped onto my porch for what I knew might be the last time. The forest had taken on that hushed quality peculiar to dusk, when diurnal creatures have settled and nocturnal ones have yet to emerge. A perfect, dangerous silence. I took one last look at my cabin, the rough walls I'd built with my own hands, the garden plot where tomatoes still ripened on the vine, the stump where I'd sat so many evenings watching the sunset through the trees. For all its simplicity, this place had been mine, a home I'd created from nothing. Now I was abandoning it, fleeing like a hunted animal. The path to the main road wasn't direct. I would need to follow a narrow dirt track for about half a mile, keeping a small ridge to my right, then cut across a shallow creek before hitting the wider gravel road that served the lakeside properties. In daylight, an easy walk. In growing darkness, with a killer in the woods, a gauntlet. I moved carefully, placing each foot deliberately to minimize noise. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching like grasping hands, shadows deepening with each passing minute. Every few yards I stopped to listen, turning in a slow circle to check my surroundings. The weight of unseen eyes pressed against my back. The first quarter mile passed without incident. I began to hope, foolishly perhaps, that the scarred man had moved on to easier prey. Maybe Ray's death had satisfied whatever twisted hunger drove him. Maybe I could reach the road, find help, return with armed authorities to reclaim my home. Then I saw it, something lying across the path ahead, visible only as a darker shadow against the ground. I approached cautiously, knife ready, every sense strained to detect danger. As I drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a horrifying tableau. It was a body, a camper I guessed from the hiking boots and outdoor clothing. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, with dark hair spread around her head like a halo. Her clothes were torn, and she was clearly dead, her glassy eyes staring sightlessly at the canopy of trees above. Her arms had deep defensive cuts, and she looked like she'd tried to fight back, her fingernails broken and bloody. I stood there, breathing hard, feeling sick. This killer was out of control, hunting the woods systematically. The woman couldn't have been dead long, hours at most. Her blood still glistened wetly in the fading light. I needed to move on, to reach help before darkness fell completely. But the sight of this stranger dead on the trail paralyzed me. I should cover her, I thought distantly. She deserved that dignity at least. But as I reached for my pack to find something to serve as a shroud, I heard a rustling behind me. I whipped around and saw him stepping out from behind a cluster of pines, emerging from the shadows like he was part of them. The scarred man stood with unnatural stillness, watching me with those empty eyes. He didn't speak. His gaze moved from my face to the hunting knife in my hand, then to the dead woman on the ground, as if introducing me to his handiwork. He held a piece of metal in his right hand, not a conventional knife, but something homemade, perhaps a sharpened file or a railroad spike, hammered flat and honed to a cutting edge. Dried blood crusted its length. I gripped my hatchet tight with one hand and my hunting knife with the other, feeling sweat drip down my face despite the cooling evening air. I tried to speak, to ask why, to understand what drove him to such violence, but my throat felt full of sand, words impossible. He stepped closer, about 10 yards between us now. I took a step back, mind racing, trying to remember if there was any place nearby I could run to, any defensive position I could take. Nothing but trees and deepening darkness in every direction. "Why are you doing this?" I managed finally, my voice a rasp. The scarred man tilted his head slightly, regarding me with something like curiosity. His voice, when it came, surprised me. Soft, almost gentle, with an educated cadence I hadn't expected. "You don't belong here," he said simply. "None of you do." Then he ran at me without another word, closing the distance between us with frightening speed. Time seemed to slow as he charged. I saw details with unnatural clarity, the way his scar pulled his upper lip into a permanent sneer, the precise arrangement of self-inflicted markings across his chest, the focused intensity in his eyes. He moved with practiced efficiency, his makeshift weapon held low and angled for an upward thrust into my abdomen. I swung the hatchet up and managed to block his first strike. Metal clanged against metal, the impact sending painful vibrations up my arm. My shoulder burned as he tried to push me off balance, his lean frame belying surprising strength. I yelled, "Stop! Why are you doing this?" But he didn't answer, his face a mask of concentration. We struggled, locked together, his weapon pushing closer to my ribs as my strength began to falter. His breath came in controlled, even measures, while mine emerged in panicked gasps. This wasn't his first fight. He knew exactly what he was doing, conserving energy, waiting for the inevitable moment when my guard would drop. I kicked at his shin, connecting solidly, making him stumble for a second. In that brief window, I wrenched away, trying to create distance between us. He recovered quickly, lunging after me, slashing at my midsection with his sharpened spike. I twisted, and it nicked my shirt but missed flesh by millimeters. I felt panic flood my chest, the knowledge that he would eventually connect, that I couldn't maintain this desperate defense indefinitely. Somehow I managed to headbutt him, driving my forehead into the bridge of his nose. It hurt me almost as much as it hurt him, stars exploding behind my eyes. But he let go for a second, blood streaming from his nostrils. I didn't waste the opportunity. I darted off the trail, ducking under low branches, pushing through dense underbrush, trying to put distance between us. He followed immediately, his footsteps unnervingly quiet compared to my crashing progress through the forest. I could hear him snapping dry sticks underfoot, breathing steadily, unhurried. He knew these woods. He knew I had nowhere to go. After 100 yards or so, I stopped behind a thick oak trunk, pressing my back against the rough bark, holding my breath. My lungs burned for air, and my legs trembled with exhaustion and fear. I clutched my knife and hatchet with white-knuckled intensity, listening for his approach. He came into view moments later, moving with that predatory calm, scanning the area methodically. Blood still trickled from his nose, but he seemed unbothered by it, focused entirely on the hunt. I tried to stay absolutely still, not even blinking, aware that the slightest movement would give away my position. He took a few steps forward, then stopped, head tilted as if listening. His eyes swept past my hiding place once, then returned, narrowing slightly. A small smile curved his lips. He knew where I was. In that moment, I realized the futility of hiding. If I waited for him to pass, he might circle back or pick up my trail again. This would only end one way, with one of us dead in these woods. I decided to try something desperate, something he might not expect from frightened prey. I held my breath, counted to 3, and stepped out from behind the tree, swinging the hatchet as hard as I could at his forearm. I connected solidly, the blade biting deep into flesh and striking bone. He screamed, a high animal sound of pain and shock, and dropped his weapon, staggering backward. He turned toward me, eyes wide with a mixture of pain, hatred, and something else. Surprise. I had become more than prey. I had become a threat. Before he could recover, I rammed into him with my shoulder, using my greater weight as an advantage. We crashed onto a carpet of pine needles, rolling in the dirt, each struggling for dominance. He tried to grab for his dropped blade with his uninjured hand, but I kicked it away and pinned his arm down, pressing the hatchet's wooden handle across his throat. He thrashed beneath me, bucking and twisting with desperate strength. I put my full weight into holding him down, feeling the sinews in my arms burn with the effort. He spat and cursed at me in a low, shaking voice, words tumbling out in a frenzied stream. "You're all the same," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Coming here, taking everything, destroying the quiet. I was here first. I was here before any of you." His words made no sense. Lake Lure had been settled for generations. The scarred man couldn't have been more than 35. But rationality had clearly abandoned him long ago, leaving only this feral creature clawing at my arms, drawing blood with his nails as he fought for freedom. I pressed harder, watching his face contort with rage, and then, gradually, fear. This was the first human emotion I'd seen in those dead eyes. The realization that he might lose this fight, that his reign of terror in these woods might end beneath the weight of a man he'd considered easy prey. "You don't have to do this," he gasped, changing tactics as his strength ebbed. "Let me go. I'll leave. You'll never see me again." "Like Ray?" I growled, pressing harder. "Like that girl on the trail? They never saw you again either." A strange light entered his eyes then, not remorse, but a kind of pride. "They were weak," he whispered. "Not like you. You fought back. You're different." His words sent a chill through me, deeper than anything I'd felt before. This wasn't just a killer. This was something fundamentally broken, something that viewed human lives as nothing more than game pieces in some private hunt. I could see it now in his face, in the way he assessed me even as I choked the life from him. He was calculating, still planning, still certain he could win. I felt him weakening beneath me, his struggles becoming more desperate but less effective. His breath rattled in his throat, eyes bulging as his oxygen-starved brain began to fail. A part of me, the civilized part, the part that had lived in Baltimore and paid taxes and held doors for strangers, screamed to stop, to show mercy, to drag this man to authorities and let justice run its course. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, remembered Ray's severed throat, the young woman's sightless eyes, the knife left deliberately by my woodpile. The scarred man had forfeited mercy when he chose to hunt human beings for sport. His eyes rolled back. His body gave a final, shuddering convulsion. Then he stopped moving entirely. I waited a long moment before easing the pressure, my arms trembling with exhaustion and aftermath adrenaline. I bent down and felt for a pulse at his neck, finding nothing. The forest around us had gone completely silent, as if holding its breath. The whole thing felt surreal, dreamlike. I dropped my hatchet and sat back on my heels, panting. The scarred man lay sprawled in death, somehow smaller now, less menacing. In the fading twilight, he looked almost ordinary, just a lean, sunburned man with strange scars and empty eyes that would never hunt again. I remained there crouched over his lifeless body until my hands stopped shaking. The reality of what I'd done, taken a human life, even in self-defense, settled over me like a heavy cloak. I wasn't a killer. I'd come to these woods seeking peace, not violence. Yet here I was, with blood on my hands and a corpse at my feet. Eventually, I forced myself to stand. I gathered my knife and hatchet, found my bag where I'd dropped it, and took one last look at the scarred man. I should cover him, I thought distantly, just as I'd wanted to cover his victim. But I had nothing to offer, and truthfully, I couldn't bring myself to touch him again. Let the forest reclaim him. Let the animals have what he'd denied so many others. A natural end, a return to the earth. I started walking toward the main road again, leaving the killer behind. Each step away from that clearing felt both like escape and penance, my muscles protesting the continued movement after such extreme exertion. The forest around me seemed different now, still dangerous, but no longer harboring the specific threat that had haunted my days and nights. As full darkness descended, I moved more carefully. using what little moonlight filtered through the canopy to guide my steps. My mind replayed the confrontation in endless loops, questioning every action, every decision. Could I have subdued him without killing? Should I have tried to run again? The questions had no answers, only the cold fact that I had survived and he had not. It took me a long time to get there, maybe hours. When I finally reached the gravel road, it was well past midnight, the moon high overhead casting silver light across the empty pavement. I walked along the shoulder, hoping to encounter another human being, someone who could help me make sense of the nightmare I'd just lived through. Eventually, headlights appeared around a bend, a pickup truck approaching slowly on the deserted road. I stepped into the path of the lights and waved my arms, aware of how I must look. Clothes torn and dirty, blood-streaked arm, wild-eyed with exhaustion and trauma. The truck slowed and stopped. A couple in their 40s, returning from some late fishing trip, rolled down their window cautiously. The man leaned out, squinting at me in the darkness. "You okay, buddy?" he called, concern warring with caution in his voice. His wife clutched his arm, whispering something I couldn't hear. I must have looked like a madman, standing there in the headlights, swaying slightly with fatigue. "Please," I managed, my voice hoarse from disuse. "I need help. There's been a murder. Several murders." They exchanged a glance, then the man nodded and unlocked the doors. "Get in," he said simply. As I climbed into their truck, the warmth of the cabin and the faint country music from the radio struck me as absurdly normal, impossibly civilized after the primal violence of the forest. The woman handed me a bottle of water, which I drank greedily, my throat burning with relief. Between gulps, I managed to explain what had happened, stumbling over my words, feeling lightheaded and disconnected from reality. I told them about Ray, about the camper on the trail, about the scarred man, and our final confrontation. I expected disbelief, suspicion, but they listened in silence, occasionally exchanging worried glances. "We need to get you to the sheriff," the man said finally, putting the truck in gear. "This is way beyond us." As we pulled away, heading toward town and authorities and the ordered world of law enforcement, I looked back at the dark line of trees receding behind us. Somewhere in that forest lay 3 bodies, Ray, the female camper, and the scarred man. One killer, 2 victims, and me caught somewhere in between innocence and guilt. The truck's headlights carved a path through the darkness, and I leaned back against the seat, closing my eyes. I had survived, but I knew the forest and the things I'd done there would never release their hold on me. The Lake Lure Sheriff's Department occupied a small building off the main highway, its weathered brick facade and green metal roof unremarkable, except for the cruisers parked in neat rows behind a chain-link fence. The couple, Jim and Diana Phillips, they'd introduced themselves during the drive, pulled into the gravel lot and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, expectant. "You want us to come in with you?" Jim asked, his weathered face creased with concern. I shook my head. "You've done enough. Thank you." Diana reached across her husband and touched my arm gently. "You take care of yourself," she said, her voice soft with compassion. They waited until I'd entered the building before driving away, taillights disappearing around the curve of the highway. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glare. A young deputy sat behind a desk, filling out paperwork with mechanical precision. He looked up as I approached, eyes widening slightly at my appearance, clothes torn and filthy, dried blood on my hands and forearms, a wild, haunted look that I could feel radiating from my face. "Sir, you need some help?" he asked, standing slowly, one hand drifting toward his sidearm. The words came in a rush then, tumbling out in a disorganized stream. Ray's murder, the scarred man stalking me, the dead camper, our final confrontation in the woods. The deputy's expression shifted from wariness to alarm as I spoke. He called for his superior, and soon I found myself in a small interrogation room, a cup of bitter coffee cooling untouched before me, as I repeated my story to Sheriff Morales, a heavy-set man with shrewd eyes and a carefully neutral expression. "So you're saying you killed this man in self-defense," he summarized after I'd finished, making notes in a small leather-bound book. "Yes," I said, my voice hoarse from talking. "He attacked me. He'd already killed at least 2 people, maybe more." Sheriff Morales studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll need to verify your story, Mr. Henderson. Deputies Wilcox and Reyes will head out at first light to locate the bodies and gather evidence. In the meantime, I'm going to have to ask you to stay in town." I spent that night in a cell. Not arrested, the sheriff assured me, just detained for questioning. The narrow cot reminded me of my cabin's simple bed, but sleep remained elusive, chased away by visions of the scarred man's eyes as life drained from them. By sunrise, deputies had discovered Ray's body, confirming at least part of my story. By midday, they'd found the female camper, identified as Melissa Keller, a graduate student from Chapel Hill who'd been reported missing 3 days earlier. By evening, guided by my description of the location, they'd recovered the scarred man's body as well. "No identification on him," Sheriff Morales told me, sitting across from me in the same interrogation room. "Fingerprints aren't in the system. Nobody knows who he is." "What happens now?" I asked, exhaustion evident in every syllable. "Now we investigate," he replied simply. "The medical examiner will perform autopsies. We'll collect evidence from the scenes. If your story checks out, and so far it seems to be, you'll be free to go." The deputies seemed reluctant to believe my story at first. I was, after all, a stranger who'd moved into the woods, built an illegal cabin on public land, and lived off the grid. But when they returned from investigating the sites, their demeanor changed. They'd found evidence that supported my account. Ray's severed throat, the defensive wounds on Melissa Keller's arms, and most tellingly, a cave about a mile from my cabin where the scarred man had apparently lived. "Never seen anything like it," Deputy Wilcox told his colleague in hushed tones as they passed my cell. "Trophies everywhere. Hair, clothing, jewelry, all labeled with dates, some going back 3 years. Their words sent a chill through me. The man I'd killed hadn't just been a murderer. He'd been a serial killer, methodically stalking and murdering people in the woods around Lake Lure for years, collecting souvenirs from his victims. How many lives had ended at his hands before fate brought him to my doorstep? How many families were missing loved ones who would never return? 4 days after my arrival at the sheriff's department, I was officially cleared of any wrongdoing. The district attorney ruled the killing justified self-defense, based on the overwhelming evidence and the scarred man's history of violence. The medical examiner eventually identified him as Grant Phillips, a former wilderness guide who disappeared from a nearby county after being suspected in a domestic violence case. He'd been living in the woods for nearly 5 years, gradually descending into a murderous psychosis that saw tourists and locals alike as invaders in his territory. Sheriff Morales returned my hunting knife and hatchet, cleaned of blood and wrapped in brown paper. "These are yours," he said, sliding them across the table. "You're free to go, Mr. Henderson. Where will you head now?" The question struck me with unexpected force. I hadn't considered what came next. The thought of returning to my cabin, to the clearing where I'd first glimpsed the scarred man, Grant Phillips, I reminded myself, he had a name now, filled me with dread. The sanctuary I'd built had been irreparably violated. "I don't know," I admitted. The sheriff nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take some time. Figure it out. The Lakeview Motel has a weekly rate if you need a place to stay temporarily." I left the sheriff's department that afternoon, stepping into sunlight that seemed too bright, too normal after the horror of the past week. The town of Lake Lure spread before me. Shops, restaurants, tourists strolling along the waterfront without any awareness of what had happened in the surrounding woods. Life continued, untouched by the violence that had consumed my world. I checked into the Lakeview Motel, a faded single-story building with peeling paint and clean rooms. The manager, a gray-haired woman named Eleanor, recognized me from the local newspaper. My story had made the front page, though thankfully without photographs. "You stay as long as you need," she told me, sliding a key across the counter. "First week's covered by the Victim Relief Fund." The room was small but comfortable. A clean bed, a shower with decent pressure, a television I didn't turn on. I stood under the hot water for nearly an hour that first night, trying to wash away not just the physical grime, but the memory of Grant Phillips's eyes as he died beneath my hands. Over the following days, I found myself approached by locals who recognized me from the news stories. Some offered awkward thanks for stopping the killer who'd haunted their community. Others asked uncomfortable questions about the confrontation, seeking gory details I refused to provide. A few eyed me with suspicion, as if I might have brought this violence with me when I moved to their quiet town. Ray's funeral was held that Saturday at a small church near the lake. I attended, standing at the back, uncomfortable in borrowed clothes. His family, a sister from Raleigh, cousins from various parts of the state, didn't know me, but his sister approached after the service. "You were his friend," she said simply, not a question. "I was," I replied. "He mentioned you in his calls, the guy in the woods who traded vegetables for beer." A small, sad smile crossed her face. "Thank you for trying to help him." I nodded, unable to form words past the lump in my throat. I should have reached Ray sooner, should have recognized the danger earlier, should have prevented his death somehow. The weight of those should-haves pressed against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I left Lake Lure the following week. I packed what little I had and caught a bus heading east. I never got to say goodbye to anyone there. Most folks didn't know me anyway. I just drifted away, carrying the memory of those nights and that scarred man with me. The bus wound through the mountains, putting distance between me and the nightmares that would follow me regardless of geography. Through the window, I watched pine forests give way to rolling hills, then to the coastal plain. I had no destination in mind, just away. Away from the cabin where I'd once sought peace. Away from the woods where I'd taken a life, even in self-defense. Sometimes I think about what I could have done differently. If I'd reported the footprints sooner, if I'd left at the first sign of trouble, if I'd insisted Ray stay with me instead of returning to his isolated cabin. But deep down, I know I did what I had to do. I'm not proud of it. I just did what was necessary to survive. In the end, that's what it comes down to: survival. Grant Phillips had surrendered his humanity to something primal and broken. Hunting fellow humans through the forests, he claimed as his exclusive territory. I'd gone to those same forests seeking escape, solitude, a simpler life. Instead, I found violence, terror, and a kind of knowledge about myself I never wanted. The certainty that, when pushed to the edge, I too could take a life. I don't live off the grid anymore. I found a small apartment in a coastal town, got a job at a hardware store, started rebuilding something resembling a normal life. I keep to myself mostly, but I'm not a hermit. I nod to neighbors, make small talk with customers, occasionally share a beer with coworkers after closing. But I still check the locks twice before bed. I still wake at the slightest sound in the night. And sometimes, in dreams, I'm back in those woods, with Grant Phillips' eyes locked on mine as the life drains from them. In those moments between sleep and waking, I wonder if I left something essential behind in that forest clearing, some piece of my humanity that, once surrendered, can never be reclaimed. Perhaps that's the true cost of survival. Not just the trauma of violence experienced or inflicted, but the knowledge that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we pretend. That under enough pressure, that line can disappear entirely. I live with that knowledge now. Carry it like a stone in my pocket, always there, always felt. And I wonder in quiet moments when the ocean breeze carries the scent of pine, if there might have been another way.